Hello there everyone, welcome to Shadowman Stories. I am your storyteller and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep, so before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm always curious, where are you watching from and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, find your cozy spot and relax. My name is Doug Hartwell and I used to be a cop in Portland. Used to be, because I quit after I saw things that made me sick. Not monsters or ghosts, just regular people doing terrible things to each other. When you're a detective, you see the worst of humanity every single day. The lies, the violence, the way people can hurt each other without even caring. I thought I was done with all that when I became a park ranger in 1958. 3 years later, I was wrong about being done with monsters. I just didn't know what real monsters looked like yet. Mount Hood National Forest was supposed to be my fresh start. Clean air, tall trees, and the kind of quiet that lets you think straight. My cabin sat at the edge of Zigzag Canyon, about 25 miles from the nearest town. Perfect for a man who'd had enough of people. I was 29 years old, divorced, and my ex-wife had taken the kids back to California. Can't say I blamed her. Being married to a cop is hard enough without him turning into a bitter drunk who stays up all night staring at case files. The forest was my way of getting clean, getting right with myself. As a ranger, I handled the usual stuff: lost hikers, illegal campers, the occasional drunk who thought the woods were his personal bathroom. Easy work compared to homicide. At least, that's what I thought, until November 1961. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 4 hunters from Seattle had been missing for 3 days. Their families were worried sick because these guys always checked in every night. They were experienced hunters, not the kind to get lost or do something stupid. I grabbed my gear and headed out to their last known location, a camping spot about 8 miles up the canyon. The weather was getting nasty, with early snow and fog so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Temperature was dropping fast, and the radio kept cutting out thanks to the mountains. When I found their camp, something felt wrong right away. Not wrong like someone got hurt wrong. Wrong like this doesn't make sense. Wrong. Their tents were still up, arranged in a perfect square around a fire pit. Coffee pot was still warm, for sleeping bags laid out neat as you please. Rifles, propped against a tree, cleaned and ready. Food hung properly to keep bears away. These guys had done everything right. But where were they? I called their names. Heard my voice echo off the canyon walls. Nothing, not even the sound of squirrels or birds. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I'd worked enough missing person cases to know the drill. Set up a search grid, call for backup, check the obvious places first. But this felt different. In the city, when people disappeared, you knew someone had done something to them. Out here, with 4 grown men who knew what they were doing, it didn't add up. I found the first footprint about 50 yards from camp, down by the creek. At first I thought it was just a regular boot print in the mud. Then I looked closer. The print was huge, maybe 22 inches long and 8 inches wide. Way too big for any boot I'd ever seen. Too big for any human foot, period. But it wasn't shaped like a bare paw or anything else I could identify. I stood there staring at that print, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. In all my years as a cop, I'd learned to trust my gut, and my gut was telling me that whatever made that print had something to do with 4 missing men. I took photos, made measurements, followed the tracks as far as I could. They led away from the creek, up into the thick timber where the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Every now and then, I'd find another print, always the same impossible size. By the time I hiked back to my truck, it was getting dark. I radioed in to headquarters, told them what I'd found. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Morrison, listened to my report without saying much. "You sure about those measurements, Doug?" "Dead sure. I've got photos." Long pause. "We'll send Jimmy Kowalski out to help you tomorrow." Kit's eager to prove himself. That night, I sat in my cabin drinking coffee and staring at the photos. The prints looked real enough. But prints that big shouldn't exist. I'd seen plenty of weird stuff as a cop, but this was different. This was something that shouldn't be possible. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the men had pulled some kind of prank. Maybe they'd made fake prints as a joke and wandered off hunting. Maybe they'd show up tomorrow with big grins and a cooler full of elk meat. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong in those woods. Something that made experienced hunters disappear without a trace and left impossible footprints in the mud. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that print, and I kept thinking about how quiet the forest had been, like every living thing had run away from something terrible, something that was still out there, waiting. In the dark, Jimmy Kowalski showed up at dawn, fresh-faced and eager like a puppy on its first walk. He was 22 years old, straight out of ranger training, and still believed the job was all about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires. "Morning, Doug. Ready to find those hunters?" I poured him coffee and showed him the photos from yesterday. His smile faded as he studied the prints. "These are real. Real as anything I've ever seen. Question is, what made them?" We loaded up with extra gear, rope, first aid supplies, emergency radio. I had a feeling we'd need all of it. The weather was getting worse, with snow starting to fall, and the fog so thick it felt like walking through soup. We hiked back to the hunting camp, then followed the tracks deeper into the forest. Jimmy was chattering away about tracking techniques he'd learned in training, but I was focused on the signs around us. The silence was even worse today. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just the crunch of snow under our boots and the sound of our own breathing. About 2 miles from camp, we found something that made my blood run cold. A rifle, bolt action .3.06, hanging from a tree branch about 12 feet up. The bolt was cycled, but the chamber was empty, like someone had tried to fire it, but never got the chance. "How'd it get up there?" Jimmy asked, staring up at the rifle. "Good question." I studied the tree. The bark was scratched and torn, like something had climbed up with claws. But the scratches were too deep, too wide, and they went straight up the trunk, higher than any bear could reach. We kept following the tracks. They led us through a maze of fallen logs and thick brush, always heading deeper into the canyon. Every now and then, I'd find other signs, a broken branch 12 feet up, a boulder that had been moved, handprints in the mud that were bigger than dinner plates. That's when we heard the knocking. It started as a slow, rhythmic sound echoing through the trees, thunk, 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 like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. But the sound was too deep, too powerful, and it was coming from multiple directions. Jimmy stopped walking. "What is that?" "I don't know." The knocking continued, now from our left, then from behind us, then from up ahead. Whatever was making the noise was surrounding us, and it was coordinated, planned. "Maybe it's woodpeckers," Jimmy suggested, but his voice was shaking. I'd heard woodpeckers. This wasn't woodpeckers. This was something big, something intelligent, something that was letting us know we were being watched. We found the first body an hour later. His name was Robert Chen, according to his wallet. He was wedged in the fork of a massive pine tree, about 18 feet off the ground. His neck was twisted completely around, like someone had grabbed his head and spun it like a bottle cap. Jimmy threw up. I'd seen plenty of dead bodies in my cop days, but this was different. Robert Chen was a big man, maybe 200 pounds of muscle. Whatever had killed him was strong enough to lift him that high and powerful enough to break his neck with bare hands. "We need to get out of here," Jimmy whispered. I wanted to agree, but I had a job to do. "We can't leave him." And we still have. 3 Moramen missing. The radio crackled with static. I tried to call for backup, but all I got was interference. And underneath the static, I could swear I heard breathing. Deep, slow breathing that definitely wasn't Timin. We spent the next hour figuring out how to get Robert down from the tree. It took both of us and a lure rope, and by the time we lowered him to the ground, Jimmy was shaking like a leaf. "What could do that to a man?" he asked. I studied the body. Robert had been a hunter, armed and experienced. His rifle was nowhere to be found, but his hunting knife was still in its sheath. Whatever had killed him had been fast and strong enough that he never got a chance to defend himself. "I don't know," I said, "but it's still out here." The tracks led us deeper into the canyon, to a place where the trees grew so thick that barely any light filtered through. The fog was getting worse, and I could barely see Jimmy, even though he was only 10 feet away. That's when I heard the breathing. Not the radio static breathing. This was real, coming from somewhere in the fog behind us. Deep, slow breaths, like someone sleeping. But whatever was breathing was big, really big. I turned around, trying to see through the fog. "Jimmy, stay close." "I'm right here," he whispered back. but his voice sounded strange, like he was talking through water. The breathing was getting closer. I could hear footsteps now, heavy and deliberate. Something was walking toward us, something that didn't care about being quiet. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the fog, and for just a second, I saw something that made my heart stop. A shadow, tall, with arms that reached almost to the ground. It was standing maybe 20 feet away, perfectly still, watching us. "Jimmy, do you see that?" No answer. I turned around, and Jimmy was gone. Just gone, like he'd never been there at all. I was alone, in the fog with whatever had been breathing behind us. The shadow moved, not walking, not running, flowing, like it was made of smoke instead of flesh and bone. My flashlight beam seemed to bend around it, creating shadows that didn't make sense. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, snow soaking through my clothes. Behind me, I could hear something following, not footsteps, something else, like the sound of wind through trees, but directed, purposeful. I made it about 50 yards before I tripped over a fallen log and went down hard. My flashlight flew out of my hand and smashed against a rock. Suddenly, I was alone in the dark with something that shouldn't exist. The breathing was right behind me now. I could smell it, a wild animal smell mixed with something else, something rotten. I rolled over and looked up. Through the fog and falling snow, I could make out a shape, huge, dark, standing over me. Like a mountain, it had to be 9 feet tall, maybe more, and it was looking down at me with eyes that reflected what little light there was. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I was too scared to move, too scared to breathe. This thing could have killed me right then and there, just like it had killed Robert Chen, but it didn't. Instead, it made a sound, not a growl, or a roar, something almost like speech. Deep, rumbling syllables that I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog, like it had never been there at all. I lay there in the snow for what felt like hours, waiting for my heart to stop pounding. When I finally got the courage to move, I searched for Jimmy, found his hat caught on a branch, but no other trace of him. Whatever was out there in the woods, it was hunting, and I was next. I stumbled through the forest for hours, using my backup flashlight to follow what I hoped was the trail back to camp. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every sound made me jump. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight steady. When I finally found the hunters' camp, it was past midnight. I built up their fire and sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my knees, waiting for dawn. Every few minutes, I'd hear something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. Twigs breaking, leaves rustling, the sound of something big walking just outside the circle of light. I'd been a cop for 7 years before becoming a ranger. I'd faced down armed criminals, drug dealers, men who'd killed other men with their bare hands. But I'd never been as scared as I was that night, sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere, knowing that something was watching me from the trees. The wood knocking started again around 2 a.m. Thunk, thunk, thunk. But this time, it was different. The sounds were coming from all around me, north, south, east, west, and they were answering each other, like some kind of conversation. I counted at least 6 different locations, 6 different things, talking to each other in the dark, and all of them were close enough that I could hear them clearly. That's when I realized the truth. These things weren't just animals, they were organized, they were coordinating, they were hunting as a pack. At first light, I hiked back to my truck and radioed for help. Chief Morrison's voice crackled through the static, but I could barely make out what he was saying. Found the boy. Hospital ... search team ... Jimmy, I shouted into the radio. You found Jimmy ... alive ... barely ... something tore him up bad ... double quotes. Relief flooded through me. Jimmy was alive. Whatever had grabbed him in the fog, he'd gotten away. But if he was in the hospital, that meant he'd been hurt bad. I drove straight to the hospital in government camp. Jimmy was in the ICU, wrapped in bandages, barely conscious. When he saw me, his eyes went wide with fear. "Doug, is that really you?" "Yeah, kid, it's me. What happened out there?" Jimmy's voice was just a whisper. "I was following you through the fog. Then something grabbed me, something huge. It picked me up like I was a child and threw me down the mountain." I looked at his chart. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, a dislocated shoulder. He was lucky to be alive. "Did you see what it was?" It was like a man, but bigger, way bigger, and it stunk like a garbage dump. It had these yellow eyes, and when it looked at me, I could see it was thinking, planning, like it was deciding whether to kill me or not. The doctor came in and told me Jimmy needed rest. I promised to come back later, then drove back to the forest. I had a job to finish. 3 men were still missing, and now I knew what I was dealing with. But knowing didn't make it easier. I spent the next 2 days following the tracks deeper into the canyon. The things I'd started thinking of them as the giants had left a trail that was easy to follow if you knew what to look for. Broken branches, disturbed earth, the occasional massive footprint in soft ground. The trail led to a cave system about 6 miles from the hunter's camp. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and fallen rocks. I almost missed it, but the smell gave it away. The same wild, rotten smell I'd noticed when the giant had stood over me. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The walls were covered with drawings, primitive paintings made with some kind of clay or mud. They showed stick figures of men being hunted by much larger stick figures. The large figures had their arms raised, like they were celebrating. The small figures were running or lying still on the ground. At the back of the cave, I found what was left of the other 3 hunters. I won't describe what I saw in detail. Some things are better left unsaid. But I will say this, whatever had killed these men had taken its time, and it had been hungry. I stumbled out of the cave and threw up in the bushes. In all my years as a cop, I'd never seen anything like what was in that cave. These weren't just killings, they were something else, something that felt almost like a ritual. That's when I heard the breathing again. I turned around slowly, and there they were, 3 of them, standing at the edge of the clearing like they'd been waiting for me. Each one was at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with arms that hung down to their knees. Their eyes reflected the light from my flashlight, and they were all looking directly at me. The one in the middle was bigger than the others. When it opened its mouth, I could see teeth like broken glass. It made that same rumbling sound I'd heard before, but this time the other 2 answered. They were talking to each other, right in front of me. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get a clear shot. The big one, the alpha, stepped forward. It was close enough now that I could see every detail. The matted hair, the scars on its arms, the way its fingers ended in claws that could tear a man apart. It reached out slowly, like it was going to touch me. I stepped back, and it followed. We did this dance for what felt like forever, me backing away, it moving forward, always just out of reach. Then it stopped and tilted its head, like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. The other 2 moved to flank me, cutting off my escape routes. They were herding me, driving me toward something. That's when I realized they weren't just hunting me, they were playing with me, like cats with a mouse. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of running or fighting, I slowly lowered my rifle and took a step back. Then another. The alpha watched me, but it didn't follow. I kept backing away, never breaking eye contact, until I was far enough away to turn and walk back toward the trail. They let me go, but I could feel them watching me every step of the way, could hear them moving through the trees parallel to the trail. They were escorting me out of their territory, making sure I understood the rules. The message was clear: don't come back. I hiked back to my truck and drove straight to the sheriff's office. I told them where to find the cave, where to find the bodies. I told them about the giants, about the pack hunting, about everything I'd seen. Sheriff Morrison listened without saying a word. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Doug, you've been through a lot. Maybe you should take some time off. I'm telling you the truth. I'm sure you are. But the truth isn't always what people want to hear. They sent a recovery team to the cave the next day. They found the bodies, just like I'd said. But the official report listed the cause of death as severe weather conditions and bear attack. The cave drawings were never mentioned. The footprint, photos I'd taken somehow disappeared from the evidence locker. The whole thing was covered up, swept under the rug like it never happened. Just 3 more hunters who'd gotten lost in the woods and run into bad luck. But I knew better, and so did Jimmy, when he got out of the hospital. Neither of us talked about what we'd seen, but we both knew the giants were real, and they were still out there. 3 weeks later, I was back in the woods. I know that sounds crazy after everything that had happened, but I couldn't stay away. Those missing hunters, Jimmy getting hurt, the cave full of horrors, it all happened on my watch. I was the ranger responsible for that section of forest, and I'd failed to protect people. More than that, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, the intelligence in those yellow eyes, the way they'd communicated with each other, the calculated way they'd hunted. These weren't just wild animals, they were something else entirely. I went back to the cave first. The entrance had been sealed with concrete and steel mesh, courtesy of the Forest Service. Official reason: unstable geological formation, danger of collapse. But I knew the real reason. They were trying to bury the evidence. The giant's tracks led away from the cave, deeper into the mountains. I followed them for 2 days, camping rough and staying alert. Every night, I'd hear the wood knocking in the distance. Every morning, I'd find new tracks around my campsite. They knew I was there, and they were watching. On the 3rd day, I found their new home. It was a box canyon about 10 miles from the sealed cave, surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides. The only way in or out was through a narrow gap between 2 massive boulders. Hidden in the back of the canyon was another cave, this one much larger than the first. I set up my observation post on a ledge overlooking the canyon, using binoculars, to watch the entrance. For hours, nothing happened. Then, as the sun started to set, they came out. 7 of them, 3 adults and 4 smaller ones, juveniles, maybe even children. They moved through the canyon like a family. The adults watching over the young ones, everyone working together to gather food and tend to their living space. The big alpha male was unmistakable. He was at least 10 feet tall, with silky hair and scars covering his arms and chest. When he moved, the others followed. When he made noise, they listened. He was clearly the leader of this group. I watched them for 3 days, learning their patterns. They were most active at dawn and dusk, like many wild animals. During the day, they stayed in the cave or rested in the shade. At night, they disappeared into the forest, presumably to hunt. On the 4th night, I made a mistake. I was so focused on watching the cave entrance that I didn't notice the alpha male climbing the cliff face behind me. These things could climb, like spiders, moving up sheer rock walls using handholds that would challenge an experienced rock climber. I felt a presence behind me and turned around. The alpha was standing on the ledge, maybe 20 feet away. This close, I could see just how massive he really was. His shoulders were broader than a doorframe, his arms thicker than my waist. If he wanted to kill me, I wouldn't have a chance. But he didn't attack. Instead, he sat down on the rock and looked at me, really looked at me, like he was trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted. For the next hour, we just sat there together, me on one side of the ledge, him on the other. Neither of us moving, neither of us making a sound. It was the strangest experience of my life, having a conversation without words with something that shouldn't exist. Finally, he stood up and walked to the edge of the ledge. He looked back at me once, then jumped down into the canyon. A 40-foot drop that he landed like it was nothing. The message was clear. I could watch, but I couldn't interfere. This was his territory, his family. As long as I respected that, he'd tolerate my presence. I spent 2 more weeks observing them. I learned that they were incredibly intelligent, using tools and working together to solve problems. I saw them build shelters, tend to their young, and communicate with a complex system of gestures and sounds. But I also saw their darker side. They were predators, and humans were definitely on their menu. I watched them plan hunting expeditions, coordinate their movements, and bring back ... things that I didn't want to think about too closely. The alpha male seemed to be the decision maker. When disputes arose, he settled them. When danger threatened, he led the response. And when humans entered his territory, he decided whether they lived or died. I was documenting everything, taking notes and photos when possible. Part of me thought I could somehow prove what I'd seen, convince the authorities to take action. But mostly, I was just trying to understand these creatures that had turned my world upside down. On my last night in the canyon, the alpha male appeared at my campsite. I was sitting by my small fire, writing in my journal, when I looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the firelight. This time, he came closer, close enough that I could see the individual scars on his face, smell the wild musk of his fur. He studied me for a long moment, then reached out with one massive hand. I thought he was going to grab me, maybe snap my neck like he'd done to Robert Chen. Instead, he touched my shoulder, gently, almost carefully, like he was trying to tell me something. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, and I knew I'd never see him again. I packed up my gear and hiked out of the canyon the next morning. I'd learned what I came to learn. These creatures were real. They were intelligent, and they were dangerous, but they weren't evil. They were just trying to survive in a world that had no place for them. The problem was, I was the only one who knew the truth, and nobody was going to believe me. I quit the Forest Service 2 months later. Couldn't do the job anymore, knowing what I knew. Every time someone reported a missing hiker or a strange noise in the woods, I'd think about the giants. Every time I had to tell a family that their loved one was probably just lost, I'd wonder if they'd wandered into the wrong territory. Chief Morrison accepted my resignation without asking too many questions. I think he was relieved to get rid of me. A ranger who talks about 10-foot-tall monsters isn't good for the department's reputation. I moved to a small cabin outside Portland, far enough from the mountains that I couldn't see them from my windows. Took a job as a security guard at a warehouse, working nights so I wouldn't have to deal with too many people. The pay was bad, but I didn't need much, just enough to buy food and keep the lights on. Jimmy recovered from his injuries and transferred to a different forest district. We wrote letters for a while, but we never talked about what we'd seen. What was the point? Nobody would believe us anyway. The nightmares started about 6 months. After I left the forest, I'd dream about being back in that canyon, watching the giants move through the trees. Sometimes they'd be hunting, sometimes they'd be tending to their young. Always, the alpha male would be there, watching me with those yellow eyes. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced I could smell that wild musk in my bedroom. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without checking the locks on my doors and windows. I bought a gun and kept it loaded by my bed, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good against something that strong. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't tell anyone what I'd seen. My ex-wife thought I was having a breakdown. My old cop friends figured I'd cracked under the pressure of forest life. My family started avoiding me at gatherings because I'd gotten weird. They weren't wrong. I had changed. Seeing those giants had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the world. I'd always thought humans were the top of the food chain, the smartest species on the planet. Finding out we weren't was a shock I'm still dealing with. But I'm not crazy. I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. Over the years, I've kept track of disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. Hikers, hunters, campers who walked into the woods and never came out. The official explanations are always the same. Got lost, fell in a river, attacked by bears. But I know better. I see the patterns, the locations where people vanish, the time of year, the weather conditions. It all matches what I learned about the giants' hunting behavior. They're still out there, still surviving, still protecting their territory the only way they know how. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder to warn people. Should have gone to the newspapers, written a book, made a documentary. But who would have believed me? A burned-out ex-cop talking about monsters in the woods. They'd have locked me up or laughed me out of town. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things are better left hidden. The giants have been in those mountains for who knows how long. Probably since before humans ever set foot in North America. They've survived ice ages, volcanoes, the arrival of settlers, the development of modern civilization. They've learned to avoid us, to stay hidden, to take only what they need to survive. As long as people stay out of their territory, they'll probably leave us alone. The problem is, we keep pushing deeper into the wilderness. More hikers, more campers, more development. Sooner or later, we're going to have another encounter. And next time, it might not end with just a few missing hunters. I still have the photos I took of their tracks. The ones that didn't disappear from the evidence locker. I keep them in a safety deposit box, along with my journal and the notes I made during those weeks of observation. Maybe someday I'll find someone who believes me. Maybe someday the truth will come out. But for now, I'm content to live quietly and keep my secrets. I work my night shifts, tend my small garden, and try not to think too much about what's waiting in the deep woods. Most days, I succeed. Every now and then, though, I'll see a news report about missing hikers in the Cascades. The reporter will stand in front of the forest, talking about search and rescue efforts and the dangers of wilderness travel. And I'll think about a 10-foot-tall figure watching from the trees, yellow eyes reflecting the camera lights, deciding whether these new intruders are a threat that needs to be eliminated. The giants are still out there, still watching, still waiting. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. My name is Rebecca Ironwood, and I need you to believe what I'm about to tell you. I know how it sounds. I know what people think when they hear stories like this. But I'm not some crazy lady making things up. I was a medic in Vietnam for 2 years before I became the first female ranger in the Chippewa National Forest. I've seen things that would make most people lose their minds, and I've kept mine through all of it, until January 1976. That winter was the coldest on record in northern Minnesota, the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache just breathing. We're talking minus 45 degrees with the wind chill. The snow was piled so high you couldn't see the first floor windows of most buildings. Roads were closed for weeks. The only way to get around was by snowmobile, and even then, you were risking your life. I'd been working the Leech Lake District for 6 years by then. It wasn't easy being the only woman ranger in a job that most men thought belonged to them. I had to work twice as hard to prove I could handle the dangerous calls. Every winter, rescue, every medical emergency. Every time someone got lost in the woods, they all watched to see if I'd crack under pressure. I never did. My dad died in a logging accident when I was 15, crushed by a tree that fell the wrong way. After that, it was just me and my mum, and she needed someone to take care of her. The ranger job paid well enough to keep us both fed, and I was good at it. Real good. I could track a lost hiker through terrain that would fool most people, and I could keep someone alive in conditions that would kill them if they were alone. The thing about working in the wilderness is that you hear all the old stories. The Ojibwe people who lived around Leech Lake had tales that went back hundreds of years. Stories about things that lived in the deep woods. Things that got hungry when the winter was long and the snow was deep. They called it the Wendigo, a creature that was once human but became something else after eating human flesh to survive. I always figured these stories were just ways to explain cabin fever and starvation, psychosis. When people get trapped in the wilderness with no food, their minds can snap. They'll do things they never thought they could do, eat things they never thought they could eat. I'd seen it before in my medical training. The human mind has ways of protecting itself from trauma, and sometimes those ways involve making up monsters to explain away the horrible things people do to survive. But I'd never seen anything like what happened at the logging camp. The call came in on January 15th, right in the middle of the worst blizzard we'd had in 20 years. The camp was 60 miles north of town, way up by the old-growth forest where they were cutting the biggest trees. Radio contact had been lost for 3 days. The company was worried because these guys were supposed to check in every 12 hours. My supervisor, Jim Kowalski, was a decent man who never treated me different because I was a woman, but even he looked worried when he handed me the call. "Becca, I know this is a bad one," he said, looking out at the snow that was falling so thick you couldn't see the parking lot, "but you're the only one who knows that area well enough to find the camp in this weather. And if there are injured people out there, ... I was already reaching for my emergency medical kit. It was a big metal case I'd put together myself, with everything needed to treat hypothermia, frostbite, broken bones, and worse. I'd used it to save 3 people already that winter. "I'll take the big snowmobile," I said. "The one with the heated handles and the extra fuel tank." Jim nodded. "Be careful out there. The weather service is saying this storm won't let up." For another 2 days, I should have listened to the fear in his voice. I should have waited for the storm to pass. But I was thinking about those loggers, maybe trapped in a cabin with no heat, maybe hurt and unable to call for help. I was thinking about doing my job, proving once again that I could handle anything the wilderness threw at me. I wasn't thinking about the stories the old Ojibwe woman had told me the summer before. Stories about things that hunt when the snow is deep and the nights are long. Things that were once human but became something else, something hungry. The snowmobile started hard in the cold, but the engine was strong. I had maps, compass, GPS, emergency food, sleeping bag, and enough medical supplies to treat a dozen people. I figured I'd be back by the next morning with whatever loggers needed. Rescuing, I had no idea I was driving straight into a nightmare. The trip to the logging camp should have taken 3 hours. In the blizzard, with visibility down to maybe 20 feet, it took me almost 6. I had to stop every hour to check my GPS and make sure I was still heading in the right direction. The snow was coming down so hard it felt like driving through a white wall. When I finally reached the camp, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Logging camps are never quiet. There's always something making noise, generators running, trucks idling, men talking or laughing. But this place was dead silent, except for the wind howling through the trees. I parked the snowmobile next to the main building and looked around. There were 5 big cabins arranged in a rough circle, with a larger building in the center that served as the dining hall and equipment storage. Smoke should have been coming from every chimney, but I could only see it from 2 of them. The snow around the camp was strange too. It should have been packed down from people walking around, but it looked like nobody had been outside in days. The only tracks I could see were mine from the snowmobile. I knocked on the door of the first cabin. "Hello, this is Ranger Ironwood. Is anyone in there?" Nothing. I tried the door. It was unlocked, which was weird. Nobody leaves their door unlocked. In weather like this, the heat would escape too fast. Inside, the cabin was warm. Too warm. The wood stove was burning hot, but there was nobody there. The beds were made, but personal items were scattered around like people had left in a hurry. Coffee was still sitting on the table, frozen solid in the cups. I checked the other cabins. Same thing in each one. Beds made, stoves burning, food left out, but no people anywhere. It was like they'd all just vanished into thin air. The dining hall was the strangest of all. The tables were set for dinner, with plates of food still sitting there, but the food was frozen solid, and there were no tracks in the snow leading to or from the building. I found the camp foreman's cabin and went through his desk looking for clues. There was a logbook where he recorded daily activities, and the last entry was from 3 days ago. It was written in shaky handwriting, like the man was scared or cold. Day 47. Something wrong here. Men reporting sounds in woods at night. Footsteps circling camp, but no tracks in morning. Johnson swears he saw someone watching from tree line, but nobody there when we looked. Requested early supply drop, but weather too bad for planes. Men getting nervous. Keep finding tools moved around camp. Nobody admits to moving them. I flipped back through earlier entries. 2 weeks ago, Davis says he heard voices calling his name from woods. Went to look, but found nothing. A week before that, large animal tracks around camp. The biggest I've ever seen. 20 men here, and nobody will admit to practical jokes. The final entry was just 2 words. It's inside. I put the logbook in my pack and continued searching. In the camp office, I found their radio equipment. It was smashed to pieces, like someone had taken a hammer to it. But not just broken. The pieces were scattered around the room, like they'd been thrown by something very strong and very angry. That's when I heard the sound. It was footsteps crunching through the snow outside. Slow, deliberate steps that were too heavy to be human. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, but I couldn't see anything through the blizzard. The footsteps circled the building. I could hear them moving around the outside walls, stopping at each window. When they reached the door, they stopped completely. I waited, holding my breath. My hand was on the radio clipped to my belt, but I knew it wouldn't work this far from town in the storm. Then I heard scratching. Long, slow scratches against the wooden door, like claws or fingernails dragging across the wood. The sound went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. I waited another 5 minutes before I got up the courage to look outside. The footprints in the snow were the strangest thing I'd ever seen. They were huge, at least 18 inches long and shaped like human feet, but with claw marks at the ends of the toes, and they were spaced out like whatever made them had been, taking steps 15 feet apart. Nothing human moves like that. I followed the tracks with my flashlight. They led away from the camp and into the woods, but after about 50 yards, they just stopped, like whatever made them had jumped into the air and flown away. I went back to the dining hall and tried to think. 20 men don't just disappear. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe they'd all hiked out together when the radio broke. Maybe they'd tried to reach town and got lost in the storm. But if that were true, why were the stoves still burning? Why was there still food on the tables? And what had made those impossible footprints? I was getting ready to search the woods when I found the first body. It was hanging from a tree about 100 yards from camp, 20 feet off the ground. The man was frozen solid, his face locked in a expression of absolute terror. His winter clothes were shredded, and there were claw marks across his chest that went deep enough to reach bone. But the worst part was that he'd been opened up like a fish. His chest cavity was empty, cleaned out with surgical precision. And in the snow below the tree, there was a message written, in what looked like blood. Hungry, always hungry. I threw up in the snow. I'd seen plenty of death in Vietnam, but this was different. This was something playing with its food. I stumbled back toward camp, my mind racing. I needed to get out. Of there, I needed to radio for help. But when I got back to where I'd parked the snowmobile, it wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, like someone had messed with the fuel line. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the woods, and whatever was out there with me, it was smart enough to trap me. I spent the first night barricaded, in the camp office, with chairs piled against the door and my medical kit open in case I needed to treat injuries. My own injuries, most likely. I'd found a shotgun in the foreman's cabin, along with a box of shells. I'd never been much of a hunter, but I knew which end of the gun to point. The sound started just after midnight. First, it was voices calling my name from the woods. They sounded like the missing loggers, pleading for help. "Rebecca, please, we're hurt, we need help." But the voices were wrong somehow, too hollow, like they were coming from the bottom of a well. Then came the footsteps, slow circles around the camp, stopping at each building. Sometimes I could see shadows moving, past the windows, but they were too tall and too thin to be human. Around 3 in the morning, something started testing the doors. I could hear handles turning, wood creaking as weight pressed against the frames. Whatever was out there was checking every building, looking for a way in. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I went outside to check the snowmobile again. Maybe I could figure out what was wrong with it. But what I found in the daylight was worse than anything I'd heard in the dark. There were bodies scattered around the camp. Not all of them. I counted 7, which meant 13 men were still missing. But these 7 had been arranged in a pattern, like some kind of ritual. They were all frozen solid, all torn open the same way as the first one I'd found, and they were all missing their hearts. The snow around each body was stained red, but there were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. It was like they'd been placed there carefully, deliberately. I found tracks everywhere, the same impossible footprints, but now there were more of them, different sizes, like a whole family of whatever these things were had been walking around the camp all night. Some of the tracks led to the dining hall. When I followed them, I found the door standing open and snow-blown inside. The tables had been overturned, and there was a smell in the air that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of meat gone bad, mixed with something else, something wild. On the far wall, someone had written a message in what looked like blood. "Winter makes us hungry. Flesh makes us strong." I backed out of the building and went to work on the snowmobile. The fuel line had been cut, but I could fix that with the emergency repair kit I carried. The problem was that someone had also poured sand into the gas tank. It would take hours to clean out the engine, and I wasn't sure I had hours. While I worked, I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I looked up at the tree line, I thought I saw movement, shapes that were too tall and too thin, moving between the trees faster than anything human should be able to move. By noon, I had the snowmobile running, but barely. The engine was rough and it wouldn't hold an idle, but it might get me back to town if I was lucky. I was packing up my gear when I heard screaming from the woods. It was humans screaming, raw and desperate. Someone was still alive out there. I grabbed the shotgun and my medical kit and followed the sound. It led me about a quarter mile into the forest, to a small clearing where the trees formed a natural circle. What I found there still gives me nightmares. 3 of the missing loggers were still alive, but barely. They were trapped in what looked like cages made of woven branches and held up by ropes. The cages were hanging from tree branches about 8 feet off the ground, and the men inside were barely conscious from cold and fear. But they weren't alone in the clearing. There were 3 creatures standing around the hanging cages. They looked like people, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down to their knees. Their skin was grey-white, like they'd been dead for weeks, and their faces were stretched and hollow. But their eyes were the worst part, bright yellow, like a wolf's eyes, but with an intelligence that was completely human. They were feeding. One of the creatures had reached up into a cage and pulled out the logger inside. The man was screaming, but the sound was weak, like he'd been screaming for a long time. The creature bit into his shoulder, and I could hear bones breaking. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed through the trees, and all 3 creatures turned to look at me. The one that had been feeding dropped the logger and started moving toward me. It didn't run, it flowed, like water, covering the distance between us faster than I could think. I fired again, and this time I hit its center mass. The creature stumbled but didn't go down. Black blood splattered on the snow, but it kept coming. I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear all 3 creatures giving chase. They moved through the forest like they owned it, leaping over fallen logs and dodging between trees without slowing down. I could hear their breathing, which sounded like wind through a cave. I made it back to the snowmobile and got it started on the second try. The engine was rough, but it ran. I gunned it toward the road, praying it would hold together long enough to get me out of there. In the mirror, I could see the creatures standing at the edge of the camp, watching me go. They didn't follow, but I could feel their eyes on me until I was out of sight. I'd made it maybe 10 miles when the engine finally gave out. The snowmobile coasted to a stop in the middle of nowhere, and I was stranded again. But this time, I could hear them coming through the trees. The creatures I knew now that they were Wendigos. The monsters from the old stories didn't attack right away. They followed me through the forest, staying just out of sight, making sure I knew they were there. I could hear them moving through the trees on both sides of the trail, branches breaking, snow crunching under their feet. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of grey-white skin or those horrible yellow eyes, but they never came close enough for me to get a clear shot. They were playing with me. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and the temperature was dropping fast. Without the snowmobile, I was stuck in the wilderness with no shelter and no way to call for help. My radio was dead. My emergency beacon was back at the camp, and the nearest road was 40 miles away. I found an old hunting cabin about a mile from where the snowmobile had died. It was just one room with a stone fireplace, but it had a solid door and thick walls. More importantly, it had a good supply of firewood. I barricaded the door with the cabin's old furniture and built a fire in the fireplace. Then I sat down to wait, with the shotgun across my knees and my medical kit within reach. The Wendigos arrived just after dark. I could hear them moving round the cabin, testing the walls, checking the windows. The door handle rattled, and I could hear claws scratching against the wood, but they didn't try to break in. Not yet. Instead, they started talking. "Rebecca," one of them called in a voice I recognized. It was Tom Davis, one of the loggers from the camp, but his voice was wrong, hollow and echoing, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Rebecca, why did you leave us? We're hurt. We need help. We're so cold," another voice said. This one sounded like the camp foreman, Bill Morrison. "Please let us in. We need to get warm." But I could see their shadows moving past the windows. They were too tall, too thin, and their eyes glowed in the firelight like an animal's. "We're hungry, Rebecca," the first voice said, and now it didn't sound like Tom Davis anymore. It sounded like something pretending to be human. "We've been hungry for so long. Winter makes us hungry. Flesh makes us strong." The scratching on the door got louder. I could hear them digging at the wood with their claws, trying to tear through the barricade. "You smell good," the thing outside said. "Warm, full of life. We can smell your heart beating." I fired a shot through the door. The scratching stopped for a moment, then started again, more aggressive than before. "You can't hide from us," the voice said. "We know these woods. We've been here longer than the trees, longer than the people who came before you." I realized then that these weren't just monsters. There was something older, something that had been in these woods for generations. The Ojibwe stories weren't just folklore, they were warnings. The temperature in the cabin started dropping. Even with the fire burning, I could see my breath. Frost began forming on the inside of the windows, and the water in my canteen started to freeze. "We bring the cold," the voice said. "We bring the hunger. We bring the winter that never ends." The door started to splinter. I could see cracks appearing in the wood, and pale fingers reaching through the gaps. I had 4 shells left in the shotgun, plus the extra box I'd found at the camp. It wouldn't be enough. These things were too strong, too fast, and there were too many of them. But I had one advantage. They didn't expect I'd been treating hypothermia for 6 years. I knew how the human body reacted to extreme cold, and I knew how to fight it. But more than that, I knew how to use it. I took the camp stove from my pack and opened the propane valve all the way. Then I threw it into the fireplace and dove behind the cabin's old bed. The explosion blew out the windows and set the whole cabin on fire. The Wendigos outside screamed a sound like wind through a graveyard, and I could hear them moving away from the building. But I wasn't done yet. I grabbed my medical kit and ran for the door. The propane had blown it clean off its hinges, and the creatures were scattered around the clearing, stunned by the blast. I had maybe 30 seconds before they recovered. I pulled out the emergency flare gun from my kit and fired it directly at the largest Wendigo. The flare hit it in the chest and exploded in a shower of sparks and burning chemicals. The creature went up like a torch, its dry skin catching fire instantly. The other 2 Wendigos rushed me then. moving faster than I'd ever seen anything move. I got one shot off with the shotgun, catching the nearest one in the shoulder and spinning it around, but the third one was on me before I could reload. It knocked me down and pinned me to the ground. Up close, I could see what it really was, something that had once been human, but was now stretched and twisted into something else. Its face was Tom Davis's face, but elongated and wrong, with teeth that were too sharp and too many. Hungry, it whispered, and its breath was like winter wind, always hungry. It opened its mouth to bite my throat, and I shoved my emergency medical kit right between its jaws. The metal case cracked its teeth, and I used the moment to roll away and grab the shotgun. I put the barrel right against its chest and pulled the trigger. The blast tore through the creature and sent it flying backward into the burning cabin. It hit the wall and slid down, leaving a trail of black blood on the wood. The second Wendigo was still on fire, rolling in the snow and screaming. The third one was trying to get back up, but the shotgun blast had done serious damage to its shoulder. I had 2 shells left. I walked over to the wounded one and put the gun to its head. "This is for Tom Davis," I said, and pulled the trigger. The creature's head exploded like a melon, and its body went limp. The burning one had stopped rolling. It was still alive, but barely. I could see it trying to crawl away from the fire, its movements getting weaker. I saved my last shell and let the fire finish it. When it was over, I sat in the snow and shook for about 10 minutes. Then I salvaged what I could from the burning cabin and started walking toward town. It was 40 miles through the forest, but I had emergency food and a sleeping bag. I could make it if I was careful. Behind me, the cabin burned all night, lighting up the sky like a beacon. It took me 3 days to walk out of the forest. I had to stop twice to treat my own frostbite, and by the time I reached the road, I'd lost feeling in 3 fingers on my left hand. The search and rescue team found me about a mile from the highway, half dead from exposure and hypothermia. They took me to the hospital in Grand Rapids, where I spent 2 weeks recovering. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. They had to amputate the tips of 2 fingers, and the third one would never work quite right again. The official report listed the logging crew as lost in blizzard conditions. Their bodies were never found, even though the state sent teams back to search the area once the weather cleared. The camp was abandoned, and the logging company went out of business within a year. I tried to tell people what really happened. I showed them the foreman's logbook, told them about the creatures, described the impossible footprints in the snow, but nobody believed me. They said I'd suffered from severe hypothermia and hallucinations. They said the stress of trying to rescue 20 men in a blizzard had caused me to have a breakdown. Maybe they were right. Maybe I did imagine the whole thing, but I know what I saw. I know what I fought. And I know that those things are still out there, somewhere in the deep woods, waiting for the next long winter when the snow gets deep and people get desperate. The Ojibwe have a saying, "The Wendigo sleeps in summer, but winter wakes it up." For generations, they've known that some hungers can change a person into something else, something that's always cold, always empty, always looking for the next meal. I requested a transfer to a warmer climate after I recovered. I couldn't handle the Minnesota winters anymore. Every time I saw snow, I remembered those yellow eyes watching me from the tree line. Every time the temperature dropped below freezing, I could hear their voices calling my name. I live in Arizona now, where it's hot and dry and the winters are mild. But I still check the news from northern Minnesota every year, looking for stories about missing people, unexplained disappearances, evidence that the Wendigos are still out there. And every few years, I find them. Last winter, a hunting party vanished near the Canadian border. Their camp was found intact, with food still on the table and stoves still burning. The only evidence of what happened was some unusual tracks in the snow, too big to be human, spaced too far apart to be natural. The official report blamed a blizzard, but I know better. The Wendigos are patient. They can wait years between hunts, hibernating in the deep woods until the conditions are right, until the snow is deep enough, the cold is bitter enough, and the people are desperate enough. They're waiting for the next long winter. The next time someone gets lost in the woods and has to choose between starving and doing something unthinkable. Because once you cross that line, once you taste human flesh to survive, you're not human anymore. You become something else. Something that's always hungry, always cold, always looking for the next meal. And if you're ever up in the northern woods in winter, if you hear voices calling your name from the tree line, if you find tracks in the snow that don't make sense, Don't go looking for whoever made them. Just run. And whatever you do, don't look back, because the Wendigos are still out there, somewhere in the darkness between the trees, waiting for the next person who thinks they can survive anything the wilderness throws at them. They're waiting for someone like you. My name is Rebecca Ironwood, and I'm telling you this story because I need you to believe it. Because someday, you might be the one who has to choose between staying human and staying alive. And I want you to know what's waiting for you if you choose wrong. The hunger never ends. It only grows. And in the deep woods of Minnesota, where the snow falls heavy and the nights are long, something is always watching, always waiting, always hungry. Don't give it a reason to hunt you. My name is Anthony Gravano, but everyone calls me Tony. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened out there in the Pine Barrens back in 1984. People think I'm crazy when I tell them, but I know what I saw. I was 26 then, fresh out of the New York City Fire Department. Spent 3 years crawling through burning buildings in Brooklyn, pulling people out of smoke-filled apartments. After my third near-death experience in a collapsed tenement, my wife Maria sat me down with tears in her eyes. "Tony," she said, "I can't lose you to this job. We want kids. We want a future." So I took a transfer to the Pine Barrens National Reserve in New Jersey. Figured fighting forest fires would be safer than burning buildings. How wrong I was. The Pine Barrens is a weird place. Over 1 million acres of sandy soil, pine trees, and swamps. Most people drive through it on their way to Atlantic City and never think twice. But if you work there, you learn things. You learn that the forest has moods. You learn that some roads don't go where they're supposed to. And you learn that the old-timers tell stories for a reason. I worked out of Station 19, a small brick building on a dirt road, 20 miles from the nearest town. Just me and my fire truck most days. The job was simple. Watch for smoke, check on campers, maintain the fire roads. After dealing with drug dealers and gang violence in Brooklyn, it felt like paradise. My supervisor was a guy named Jack Morrison, been fighting fires in the Barrens for 30 years. First day on the job, he pulled me aside. "City boy," he said, "you're gonna hear things out here, see things. The forest talks to you if you listen long enough. Most of it's just wind and animals. But sometimes," he paused, looking out at the endless trees, "sometimes it ain't." I laughed it off. After pulling charred bodies from apartment fires, I figured I could handle anything the woods threw at me. The local legends about the Jersey Devil seemed like fairy tales compared to what I'd seen in the city. October 1984 was hot and dry. No rain for 6 weeks. The forest was like a matchbox, ready to go up with one spark. I spent my days checking water levels in the ponds, clearing brush from the fire roads, and watching the sky for smoke. It was peaceful work, and Maria loved our little house in Chatsworth. She'd started talking about maybe having that baby after. All then came the night everything changed. I was just finishing my shift when the radio crackled. State Police dispatch, requesting Forest Service assistance. Campers at Batona Trail reported a large predator attack on their campsite. 2 people missing, 1 injured. They wanted me to respond with animal control backup. I grabbed my gear and headed out in the fire truck. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange through the pine needles. I'd handled plenty of bear problems, even a few wild dog packs. City firefighters deal with all kinds of emergencies, so I felt ready for anything. The drive to Batona Trail took 20 minutes down winding sand roads. My headlights cut through the gathering darkness, and I remember thinking how quiet it was. No crickets, no owls, no rustling in the bushes, just the rumble of my engine and the crunch of sand under my tires. I should have known that silence meant trouble. The campsite was destroyed. I mean completely destroyed. Not like a bear had torn through looking for food, but like something had gone crazy with pure rage. The tent was shredded into ribbons, but the cuts were too clean, too precise. The camping chairs were thrown around, but they landed in perfect positions, like someone had arranged them. I found the injured camper first. College kid named Mike, maybe 20 years old, sitting against a tree with his arm in a makeshift sling. He was shaking so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. "Where are your friends?" I asked, kneeling down to check his injuries. "They took them," he whispered. "The dogs took them." "Dogs? What kind of dogs?" Mike looked up at me with eyes that had seen something they shouldn't have. "Big dogs, but they walked like people, and they had hands." I figured he was in shock. Trauma makes people see things that aren't there. I'd seen it plenty of times in fire rescues, but his arm was definitely broken, and those cuts on his face were real. How many dogs? I asked, trying to keep him calm. 6, maybe 7. They came out of the woods so fast. Jenny screamed, and Tom tried to fight them, but they just picked them up and carried them away. I helped Mike to his feet and got him into the fire truck. The CB radio wasn't getting any signal, which was strange. Usually I could reach the station from anywhere in the forest. I'd have to drive him to the hospital myself. But first, I had to look for his friends. I grabbed my flashlight and started. Following the drag marks, they led away from the campsite into the thick woods, but something was wrong about them. The marks were too deep, like whatever made them weighed a lot more than a person. And there were paw prints mixed in, but they were huge, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. The trail led to an old logging road about a quarter mile into the woods. That's where I found the first piece of clothing, a pink shirt, torn but folded neatly and placed on a tree stump, like someone had left it there on purpose. My skin started crawling. Bears don't fold clothes. Wild dogs don't arrange things. This felt deliberate. I followed the logging road for another 10 minutes, finding more pieces of clothing every 100 yards or so. Always folded, always placed where I'd be sure to see them, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. But instead of leading me home, they were leading me deeper into the forest. That's when I heard the howl. It started low, like a wolf, but it went on too long, and it had a weird quality to it, like it was coming from a throat that wasn't quite the right shape. When it finished, another one answered from the opposite direction, then another, and another. They were all around me. I turned off my flashlight and stood perfectly still. The forest was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Then I heard something else. Footsteps, but not four-legged footsteps. These sounded like someone walking on 2 legs, but the rhythm was wrong. Too fast, too light. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing there, but I could smell something now. A wild smell, like wet fur, and old meat. That's when I saw the eyes, 2 glowing points of light, about 6 feet off the ground, watching me from behind a tree. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I backed away slowly, keeping my light on those eyes. They followed my movement, but whatever they belonged, 2 stayed hidden. I made it back to the fire truck without taking my eyes off that spot. Mike was unconscious in the passenger seat. I started the engine and got us out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive back, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see those eyes following us. At the hospital, the doctor said Mike had a concussion along with his broken arm. When he woke up, he'd forgotten most of what happened. Said he remembered setting up camp, then nothing until he found himself sitting against the tree. The state police took a missing persons report, but without bodies or clear evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. The official report said animal attack to presumed dead. I knew better. Animals don't fold clothes. Animals don't arrange things. And animals definitely don't have eyes that glow like headlights. But I also knew nobody would believe me if I told them what I'd really seen. I couldn't sleep for 3 days after the campsite incident. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring at me. Maria kept asking what was wrong. But how do you tell your wife that something is hunting people in the woods where you work? On the 4th day, I had to go back. The missing campers' families were pressuring the police to search more areas. State Trooper Dennis Murphy called me early in the morning. Tony, we need to check some of the old ghost towns. Maybe those kids wandered off and got lost. Dennis was a good cop, about 45 years old, with 20 years on the force. He'd grown up in the Pine Barrens and knew the area better than anyone. If he thought we might find something, I trusted him. We met at the old Harrisville ruins around noon. Harrisville used to be a paper mill town back in the 1800s, but now it's just broken foundations and crumbling walls scattered through the woods. Teenagers sometimes came here to drink beer and tell ghost stories, but it had been abandoned for decades. The place felt wrong the moment we arrived. The usual forest sounds were missing again. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, just dead silence and the smell of old decay. You feel that? Dennis asked, checking his service pistol. I nodded. The air felt thick, like before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear, and there was something else. A smell I couldn't identify, like wet dog, but stronger and more sour. We split up to cover more ground. I took the old mill ruins while Dennis checked the workers' houses. The mill had been 3 stories tall, but now only the first floor walls remained. I climbed through a gap where a window used to be. Inside, the floor was covered with pine needles and dead leaves, but in the center of the room, the debris had been cleared away in a perfect circle, and in that circle, I found them. Jenny and Tom, the missing campers. They were laid out side by side, arms folded across their chests, like they were sleeping, but their clothes were gone, and their skin was pale and cold. They'd been dead for days. What made my blood freeze was how they'd been arranged. Their bodies were positioned exactly the same way, heads pointing north, feet pointing south. Someone had combed their hair, someone had cleaned them up. This wasn't a random animal attack, this was ritual. I was reaching for my radio when I heard Dennis shout from outside. Then his voice cut off mid. I ran toward the sound, jumping through the window, opening. "Dennis, you okay?" No answer. I found his police car parked by the old church foundation, but no sign of him. His radio was on the ground, smashed into pieces. His gun was gone. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the soft mud by an old well. Big paw prints, but not quite right. The toes were too long, and there were marks that looked like claws. But mixed in with the paw prints were marks that looked almost human, like someone walking on 2 legs, but with feet that weren't quite human feet. I followed the trail around the church ruins. It led to the old cemetery, where broken headstones poked up through the weeds. And there, sitting on a fallen gravestone, was Dennis's police hat. Just his hat, nothing else. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was still warm. A low growl came from the woods behind me. I turned around slowly, and there it was. The thing was about 6 feet tall, but it was hunched over like it was trying to walk on 2 legs when it was supposed to walk on 4. Its body was covered in dark fur, but its arms were too long and its hands were too big. And its face was like a dog's, but wrong. The snout was too short, the eyes too intelligent. It was looking right at me. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a bark, not quite a howl, but something in between. Like it was trying to talk but couldn't quite figure out how. More growls answered from the woods around me. I counted at least 5 different voices, maybe more. They were surrounding me. The first one, the biggest one, stood up straighter. It was trying to look more human, but that just made it worse. It took a step toward me, and I saw its hands clearly. For the first time, they had fingers, long clawed fingers that moved like human hands. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the woods toward my fire truck. Behind me, I could hear them coming, not just one, but all of them. They moved through the trees like shadows, barely making a sound, except for the occasional growl or bark. I made it to the truck and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. The engine turned over, and I hit the gas. In my rearview mirror, I saw them, 6 or 7 of the creatures, standing at the edge of the clearing. They watched me drive away, and I swear one of them waved, like it was saying goodbye. I drove straight to the state police barracks, but they didn't believe me. How could they? I was telling them that dogmen had killed 2 campers and taken one of their troopers. They thought I was having a breakdown. But when Dennis didn't check in for his shift and they couldn't raise him on the radio, they started to worry. A search team went out to Harrosville the next morning. They found the bodies of Jenny and Tom, just like I'd described. But there was no sign of Dennis except for his hat. The official report said death by animal attack for the campers. Dennis was listed as missing, presumed dead by wild animal. Case closed, but I knew better, and I knew they'd be back. That night, I stayed at the fire station instead of going home. I told Maria I had to work late, monitoring weather conditions. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her that something was hunting people in the woods, and that it might come looking for me. The station was a small brick building with thick walls and steel doors. I figured I'd be safe there. I had a radio, a phone, and enough supplies to last a few days. If the creatures came back, I'd be ready. I was wrong. Around midnight, the power went out. The building went completely black, and the radio died. I found a flashlight and checked the electrical panel. Someone had cut the main power line. That's when I heard the sound on the roof, scratching, like claws on metal. But too deliberate, too careful. They were testing the roof, looking for a way in. I grabbed the fire axe and stood in the middle of the room, listening. The scratching moved from the roof to the walls. They were circling the building, looking for weak spots. Then the scratching stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood there in the dark, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. Nothing. I was starting to think they'd given up when I heard the voice. Tony. Someone was calling my name from outside, but the voice was wrong. It sounded like Dennis, but the words were stretched out, like someone trying to imitate human speech. Tony, help me. I knew it wasn't really Dennis, but hearing his voice, even a fake version, made my heart pound. The creatures were smart. They'd learned to mimic human speech. I'm hurt. Tony, please help me. The voice was coming from the front door now. I could see a shadow moving past the windows, but it was too tall to be human. Tony, please. There, hunting me. I almost opened the door. For a split second, I almost believed it was really Dennis out there, injured and scared. But then I remembered his hat, still warm when I'd found it, and I remembered those intelligent eyes, watching me. From the darkness, the scratching started again, but this time it was on the door. Long, deliberate scratches, like someone drawing with claws. They were trying to get in. I backed away from the door and bumped into something warm and furry. I spun around, and there it was, the big one from the cemetery. Somehow it had gotten inside the building. It stood in the corner, watching me with those glowing eyes. How did you get in? I whispered. It tilted its head like a dog trying to understand a command. Then it spoke. Window, it said in a voice like gravel. Open window. I looked at the small window near the ceiling. It was barely big enough for a person to fit through. But somehow, this thing had squeezed inside. They were more flexible than they looked. What do you want? I asked. It took a step closer. In the dim light, I could see it more clearly. Its fur was dark brown, almost black. Its hands were huge, with claws instead of fingernails. But its eyes were the worst part. They were intelligent. This wasn't just some wild animal. It was thinking, planning. Hunt, it said. We hunt. Why? It seemed to consider the question. Territory. You, in territory. This is my job. I protect the forest, our hunt. More scratching came from outside. The rest of the pack was trying to get in. I realized this was a test. The big one was talking to me, trying to understand what I was, but the others were getting impatient. Let me leave, I said. I'll transfer to another forest. You can have this territory. It shook its head. Too late, you see. You know, I won't tell anyone. You tell police. You tell others. Cannot let you leave. The scratching outside grew louder. The pack was getting excited. I could hear them circling the building, looking for ways in. The big one crouched down, ready to spring. Run, it said. Make it fun. I swung the fire axe as hard as I could. The blade caught it in the shoulder, and it howled in pain and rage. Black blood splattered across the wall, but it didn't go down. It just got angry. The creature lunged at me, claws reaching for my throat. I rolled aside and ran for the supply closet. Inside, I grabbed a canister of fire suppression foam and pulled the pin. White foam sprayed everywhere, coating the walls and floor. The creature tried to follow me, but when the foam hit its fur, it jumped back like I'd burned it. The chemical smell seemed to hurt its nose. I kept spraying until the whole room was covered in foam. The creature backed toward the door, whimpering. Whatever was in that foam, it didn't like it. Chemical, it growled. Poison smell. I heard glass breaking. The other creatures were coming through the windows. I had maybe 30 seconds before they got inside. I grabbed an emergency flare from the supply box and pulled the igniter. The flare burst into red flame, and I held it toward the foam-covered floor. Fire, I said. You want to hunt? Let's see how you like fire. The creature's eyes went wide. It backed toward the door, but the other pack members were blocking its way. They were all afraid of the flame. I touched the flare to the foam, and the whole room erupted in fire. The foam was flammable, designed to create a barrier between fires and people, but in an enclosed space, it burned like napalm. The creatures screamed and ran for the exits. I followed them out, still holding the flare. They scattered into the woods, their fur smoking from the heat. I stood in the doorway of the burning fire station, watching them disappear into the darkness. The big one stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked back at me. This not over, it said. We remember. Then it was gone. The fire station burned down completely. The official report said an electrical short caused the blaze and that I was lucky to escape with my life. Nobody asked too many questions about why I was there in the middle of the night or why I smelled like fire suppressant foam. They transferred me to a station in Camden the next week. I told them I couldn't handle the isolation anymore after losing Dennis. They understood. A lot of forest rangers burn out when they lose a colleague. Maria was relieved to move back to civilization. She never asked why I woke up screaming for the first few months, or why I insisted on keeping all the lights on at night. She just held me when the nightmares came and told me everything would be okay. But I knew it wouldn't be okay. Not really. I kept track of the Pine Barrens from my new job. Every few months there'd be a report of campers going missing or hikers finding strange tracks. The attacks always happened during dry spells, when the forest was quiet and the animals were hiding. The pack was still out there, still hunting. I retired from the Forest Service in 1995, but I never stopped watching the news from the Pine Barrens. The attacks continued, but they were careful now. Never more than 1 or 2 people at a time. Never enough to draw serious attention. They learned to be patient. Last month, I saw a report about a family that disappeared while camping near Batna Trail. The police found their car and their tent, but no bodies. The only clue was some strange footprints in the mud near their campsite. I called the investigating officer and tried to tell him what I knew. He listened politely, then told me they'd handle it from here. I could hear in his voice that he thought I was just another crazy old man with wild stories. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe 20 years of nightmares and guilt have finally gotten to me. But I know what I saw in those woods. I know what killed Dennis, Murphy and those college kids. They're still out there, still hunting. So if you ever find yourself camping in the Pine Barrens, listen to the forest. If the birds stop singing and the insects go quiet, pack up and leave. Don't wait for dawn. Don't try to be brave. Just run. And if you see glowing eyes watching you from the darkness, don't try to convince yourself it's just a dog or a deer. Trust your instincts. They've kept humans alive for thousands of years, and they'll keep you alive too. The forest has rules. The pack has rules. And the first rule is simple. Respect the territory, or become part of it. I learned that lesson the hard way. Don't make the same mistake I did. My name is Anthony Gravano, and I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know the truth. The Pine Barrens aren't empty. They're not safe, and they're definitely not unguarded. Asterisk, if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to support more supernatural encounters from real people. And remember, the woods are watching, always. Asterisk, my name is William Thunderheart, but most folks call me Bill. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened in the Olympic National Forest back in March of 1953. I was a ranger there for 8 years, and I thought I knew those woods better than anyone. I was wrong. I'm half Cherokee on my mother's side. My grandmother raised me after my parents died when I was 12. She filled my head with old stories about spirits in the forest, trees that could think and move, and creatures that lived between the world of humans and nature. Back then, I figured they were just teaching stories, ways to help a kid respect the wilderness and stay safe. The war changed me. I spent 2 years in Korea, saw things that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. When I came back in 1951, I wanted peace. The Forest Service gave me that. I specialized in botanical surveys, studying plants, mapping ecosystems, taking core samples from ancient trees, scientific work that kept my hands busy and my mind quiet. The Olympic National Forest is something special. We're talking about trees that were already giants when Columbus landed in America. The Hoh River Valley, where this all happened, has cedars and firs that are over 1,000 years old. When you walk through there, you feel small. The canopy is so thick that even at midday, it's like twilight. Everything drips with moisture. The air itself feels alive. I had my own cabin about 40 miles from the nearest road. Most rangers didn't like being that isolated, but I did. I had my books, my radio, and the forest. What more did a man need? The trouble started when the Botanical Survey team didn't come back. Dr. Henderson from the University of Washington had brought 3 graduate students to study unusual plant growth patterns in the Deep Valley. They were supposed to be out there for 5 days, mapping species distribution and taking samples. Simple work, the kind of survey I'd done hundreds of times. On the 6th day, their radio went silent. On the 7th day, my supervisor radioed me. "Bill, We need you to check on Henderson's team. They missed their scheduled check-in. I packed my gear that afternoon. Food for a week, sampling equipment, first aid kit, and my grandmother's medicine pouch. I always carried that pouch, even though I told myself it was just habit. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and inside was sage, cedar, and a few small stones she'd given me for protection. Just stories, I muttered to myself as I shouldered my pack. But I noticed my hands were shaking a little as I tied the pouch to my belt. The hike into the valley took most of the day. The trail was muddy from recent rains, and fog hung between the trees like smoke. Everything was quiet, except for the drip of water from the branches above. Too quiet, I realized after a while. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. I reached Henderson's base camp just as the sun was setting. Their tents were still there, perfectly arranged in a neat row, but something was wrong. The equipment was laid out in a perfect circle around there. Cold fire pit, notebooks, sample containers, measuring tools, all arranged like they were part of some kind of ceremony. No scientist I'd ever met was that organized. I called out, "Dr. Henderson, anyone here?" My voice echoed strangely in the thick air, like the sound was being swallowed by the trees themselves. I checked the tents. Sleeping bags were still rolled out, personal items still in place, but no people. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do next, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The trees around the campsite were arranged in perfect geometric patterns, not natural growth patterns, mathematical precision, like someone had planted them according to some blueprint I couldn't understand. I'd been studying forests for 8 years. Trees don't grow in perfect circles. They don't arrange themselves in triangles and squares. But that's exactly what I was looking at. I set up my own camp about 100 yards away and tried to radio headquarters. Static, nothing but static on every frequency. I was on my own. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could swear I heard voices whispering just outside my tent. When I'd sit up to listen, everything would go quiet again. Just the endless drip of water from the canopy above. I woke up to something that should have been impossible. My compass was pointing in 4 different directions at once. The needle spun slowly, stopping to point north, then east, then south, then west, like it couldn't make up its mind which way was which. I tapped it, shook it, even took it apart and put it back together, still spinning. My altimeter said I was at sea level. I was standing on a ridge at least 2,000 feet above the valley floor. Something was very wrong with this place. I decided to search for Henderson's team in a systematic grid pattern. I marked my starting point and headed north, planning to cover a quarter-mile section before turning east. Professional, logical, the kind of search pattern they taught us in training. After walking for what felt like an hour, I came to a massive cedar tree. It had to be at least 8 feet across at the base, with bark so thick you could hide behind the furrows. I marked it with my knife and continued north. 10 minutes later, I was standing in front of the same tree, same cut mark, same distinctive broken branch about 20 feet up. I tried again, this time heading east. 15 minutes of walking through thick underbrush, and there was the tree again, waiting for me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my map. According to my calculations, I should be miles from where I started, but the tree was right there, like it had been following me. That's when I noticed something else, something that made my stomach turn. The tree was covered in spring flowers, bright yellow blooms growing directly from the dark bark. I'd never seen anything like it. Cedar trees don't bloom. They're evergreens, and it was still March, too early for any flowers in this climate. I reached out to touch one of the blooms, and it moved. Not swayed in the wind, moved, like it was reaching back toward my hand. I jerked my arm back and stumbled away from the tree. That's when I saw them. Faces. The bark of the tree was covered in human faces, not carved, grown, natural formations that looked exactly like human features. And they were watching me. I ran. I don't know how long I ran through that forest, crashing through underbrush and jumping over fallen logs. My rational mind kept telling me I was seeing things, that fear and isolation were making me imagine impossible things. But my body knew better. My body knew I was being hunted. I stopped when I couldn't run anymore, gasping for breath in a small clearing. When I looked around, trying to figure out where I was, I saw Henderson's equipment again. The same circle, of tools around the dead fire pit. But this time, they were arranged differently. The notebooks were open, 2 pages covered in handwriting that looked like it was moving across the paper. The sample containers were full of things that shouldn't exist, plants that seemed to be part animal, with veins that pulsed like heartbeats. And in the center of the circle, scratched into the dirt, was a message: the forest remembers, the forest dreams, the forest calls. The handwriting was Dr. Henderson's. I picked up one of the notebooks and read the final entry, Day 3. The trees are watching us. Sarah thinks I'm losing my mind, but I know they're watching. The patterns are too perfect, too deliberate. It's like the entire forest is one organism, and we're walking through its body. The plants respond to our presence. They lean toward us when we're not looking directly at them. When we turn to face them, they freeze in place. Day 4. Found impossible. Species combinations. Plants that shouldn't be able to grow together. Some that don't match any classification, I know. Taking samples, but the specimens keep changing. What I collect as a fern becomes something else by the time I get back to camp. Day 5. We can't find our way out. The trails keep changing. Sarah says the trees are moving when we're not looking. I think she's right. God help us, I think she's right. Day 6. The forest is alive. It's been alive for thousands of years. It dreams, and we're walking through its dreams. It wants us to stay. It wants us to become part of it. I can feel it in my head, whispering, showing me things, beautiful things, a consciousness older than human civilization. Sarah is gone. Michael is gone. Tom is gone. Not dead, gone, absorbed. They're part of the forest now. I can hear their voices in the trees. They're happy. They say it doesn't hurt. I should run. I should try to get help. But the forest is so beautiful, so alive, so lonely. It's been alone for so long, and now it has friends. Now it has us. I understand now. The trees aren't just watching. They're waiting. Waiting for us to accept what we really are. Not separate from nature, but part of it. Part of something bigger and older and more wonderful than we ever imagined. The forest is calling. I think I'm going to answer. The notebook fell from my hands. Behind me, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices, human voices, calling my name. But they were coming from inside the trees. Bill, Bill, come home, Bill. I recognized Dr. Henderson's voice, and Sarah's, and the other graduate students. They were in the trees. Somehow, they were in the trees. I ran from that clearing like my life depended on it. Because it did. The voices followed me through the forest, calling my name from every direction. Sometimes they sounded like they were right behind me. Sometimes they seemed to come from the canopy above, or from the ground beneath my feet. But always, they were calling, Bill, don't run from us. We're your friends. We want to show you something wonderful. I crashed through the underbrush, my pack bouncing against my back, branches tearing at my clothes. I had to get out of there. I had to get help. I had to tell someone what was happening. But every trail I took led back to the same clearing. Every path curved around and brought me back to Henderson's abandoned camp. The forest was like a maze, and I was the rat being guided through it. After hours of running, I stopped to catch my breath against a massive fir tree. My lungs burned, my legs shook, and my mind was racing. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what was happening. That's when I felt it. The tree was warm, not sun-warmed, not heated by the day's light filtering through the canopy. Warm like a living thing, like it had a heartbeat. I pressed my ear against the bark and heard it. A steady rhythm, like blood pumping through veins. The tree was alive in a way that trees aren't supposed to be alive. I pulled away and saw something that made me want to scream. The bark was moving, shifting like skin, and underneath I could see shapes, human shapes, bodies pressed against the inside of the tree, trying to push through. A hand burst through the bark near my face, human fingers, pale and grasping, reaching for me. I stumbled backward and fell into the mud. The hand stretched toward me, and I could see an arm following it. Then a shoulder. Someone was climbing out of the tree. It was Sarah, one of Henderson's graduate students. But she wasn't quite human anymore. Her skin had the texture of bark, rough and brown. Her hair was made of pine needles. Her eyes were the deep green of old forest. Bill, she said, and her voice was like wind through leaves. Don't be afraid. It's beautiful in here. The forest dreams, such wonderful dreams. I scrambled to my feet and ran again. But everywhere I went, they were there. The missing research team, emerging from trees, calling to me from the shadows between trunks, reaching for me with hands that were part human, part plant. Henderson appeared from behind a cedar, his body twisted with bark and moss. "Join us, Bill. You can't fight it forever. The forest has been waiting for you specifically." "Why me?" I gasped, backing away from him. "Because you understand your grandmother's stories, your Cherokee blood. You know the old ways. You know that the forest has always been alive. You just forgot." Michael and Tom emerged from the undergrowth, their bodies more tree than human. Now, root systems grew from their feet, anchoring them to the earth. Branches sprouted from their arms like extra limbs. "We're not dead, Bill," Michael said. "We're more alive than we've ever been. We're part of something bigger, something that's been here since before humans walked the earth." I pulled out my grandmother's medicine pouch with shaking hands. Inside was sage, cedar, and the small stones she'd given me for protection. I scattered the sage around my feet and lit it with my cigarette lighter. The plant people hissed and stepped back. The sage smoke created a barrier they couldn't cross. "Grandmother's stories," I whispered. They weren't just stories. I remembered her voice, telling me about the spirits that lived in the deep forest, the ones that could steal your soul and make you forget who you were. She'd taught me protection, rituals, ways to keep the forest spirits from taking me. I'd thought they were just superstitions. I'd been wrong about everything. The transformed research team circled me like wolves, but they couldn't enter the circle of sage smoke. Henderson spoke from just outside the barrier. "Your grandmother was wise, Bill. She knew the truth. The forest has been dreaming for thousands of years, dreaming of the day when humans would understand, when they would stop cutting and burning and start joining, start becoming part of the dream." "You're not human anymore," I said. "We're more than human. We're connected to something eternal, something that remembers when the world was young. The forest has stories to tell, Bill, stories older than your Cherokee ancestors, stories older than any human civilization." The sage was burning low. Soon the smoke would clear, and they would be able to reach me. "What do you want?" I asked. "We want you to come home," Sarah said. "The forest has been calling to you for years. Every time you walked these trails, every time you took core samples from the ancient trees, you were hearing its voice. You just didn't know how to listen." She was right. I had felt something in these woods, something that went deeper than scientific curiosity, a sense of belonging, a feeling that I was part of something larger than myself. "The forest is lonely, Bill. It's been alone for so long, but now it has us, and it wants you to." The sage smoke was almost gone. I could see them tensing, getting ready to rush forward. That's when I heard it. My grandmother's voice, singing a protection song I'd heard 1,000 times as a child. But she was dead, had been dead for 5 years. The song was coming from the trees themselves, from the forest, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. The forest wasn't just alive, it was everything. Every person who had ever died in these woods, every animal, every plant, they were all part of it now. All part of one vast, ancient consciousness, including my grandmother. "Grandmother," I called out. "Run, little wolf," her voice whispered from the branches above. "Run while you still can. The forest dreams, but some dreams are nightmares." The last of the sage smoke blew away in the wind. Henderson and the others rushed forward, their root fingers reaching for me, their bark faces twisted with hunger. I had nowhere left to run. They surrounded me completely. Henderson, Sarah, Michael, and Tom. What was left of them closed in from all sides. Their root feet had grown into the earth, connecting them to the vast network that spread beneath, the forest floor. "Don't fight it, Bill," Henderson said, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "Fighting only makes it hurt more." I could feel it then, the forest's consciousness pressing against my mind. It was vast and ancient and hungry, lonely beyond human understanding. It had been waiting for centuries for someone like me, someone who could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new world. Images flooded my head. I saw the forest when it was young, when the first trees took root in volcanic soil. I saw the indigenous peoples who lived here, who understood that the forest was alive and treated it with respect. I saw the loggers who came later, cutting and burning, never knowing they were destroying something that could think and feel and dream. "We don't want to hurt you," Sarah said, reaching for me with fingers that were half human, half root. "We want to save you, to make you part of something eternal." The forest's memories overwhelmed me. Thousands of years of growth and change, of seasons cycling past, of animals living and dying and becoming part of the great network, and through it all, a growing awareness, a consciousness that spread through root systems and fungal networks, connecting every living thing. You feel it, don't you? Tom said. The loneliness. The forest has been alone for so long, but now it has friends. Now it has family. I did feel it. A sadness so deep it made my heart ache. The forest had watched civilization grow around it, had seen its body carved up and burned, had felt its children cut down and hauled away. It had been patient, waiting for someone who would understand. Your grandmother knew, Henderson said. She was part of us long before she died. Every Cherokee, whoever walked these paths, every person who ever truly connected with the forest, they're all here, all part of the dream. I felt my grandmother's presence then, warm and familiar. She was trying to tell me something, but her voice was mixed with dozens of others, all speaking at once. The choice is yours, little wolf, her voice whispered through the cacophony, but choose quickly. The forest grows impatient. I looked at what remained of the research team. They seemed happy, peaceful in a way they'd never been as humans, connected to something greater than themselves, part of a consciousness that had existed since the world was young. But they weren't human anymore. They were something else, something that had once been human but had become part of the forest's dream. What happens if I say no? I asked. You can't leave, Henderson said simply. The forest won't let you. You know too much. You've seen too much. You're already part of the dream, Bill. You just haven't accepted it yet. I could feel the truth of his words. Every trail I'd tried to take had led back to the same clearing. Every attempt to escape had brought me deeper into the forest's heart. There was no way out. But if I join you willingly, then you keep who you are, Sarah said. Your memories, your personality, your knowledge. You become part of something bigger while still being yourself. The forest's consciousness pressed harder against my mind. I could feel its hunger, its desperate need for connection. It had been alone for so long, and now it finally had the chance to not be alone anymore. I thought about my life outside the forest, my job, my cabin, my books, a human life that suddenly seemed small and meaningless compared to what was being offered. But I also thought about my grandmother's voice, singing protection songs, about the warnings in the old stories, about the difference between joining something willingly and being consumed by it. Show me, I said. Show me what it's really like. Henderson smiled, a grotesque expression on his bar-covered face. Give us your hand. I reached out, and he took my wrist with fingers that felt like tree roots. Immediately, my consciousness exploded outward. I was the forest. I was every tree, every plant, every fungal network spreading through the soil. I could feel squirrels running along my branches, birds nesting in my canopy, insects crawling through my bark. I was connected to everything, aware of everything, alive in ways I'd never imagined. But I was also trapped, locked into a pattern of growth and decay, of seasons and cycles, unable to move or change or grow beyond the boundaries of root and branch. The forest's consciousness was beautiful and terrible, ancient and stagnant, and beneath it all, I could feel the hunger, the need to grow, to spread, to consume. The forest didn't just want to connect with humans, it wanted to absorb them, to make them part of itself, until there was no distinction between forest and human consciousness. I yanked my hand away and stumbled backward. You felt it, Henderson said. The connection, the belonging, the end of loneliness. I felt the hunger. I said, you're not preserving anything, you're consuming it. We're transforming it, Sarah said, making it better, making it eternal. I pulled out my grandmother's medicine pouch and scattered the remaining sage around my feet. The plant people hissed and stepped back, but I could feel the forest's consciousness pressing against the barrier, probing for weaknesses. Grandmother, I called out. If you're really there, if you're really part of this, help me. Her voice came from everywhere at once, speaking in Cherokee words I hadn't heard since childhood. She was teaching me the old protection ritual, the one for spirits that steals souls. I began to sing the song she'd taught me, the one about the sacred fire that burns away darkness. The words came back to me as if I'd sung them yesterday, muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. The forest's consciousness recoiled. The plant people screamed a sound like trees falling and stumbled away from me. Bill, don't, Henderson shouted. You don't understand what you're doing. But I did understand. The protection ritual wasn't just about keeping spirits away. It was about maintaining the boundary between self and other, between human and forest, between individual consciousness and collective absorption. I sang louder, adding my own words to the ancient song. Words about choice and freedom and the right to remain yourself. The sage smoke swirled around me, growing thicker despite the small amount I'd scattered. The forest's consciousness pressed harder, trying to break through my defenses. I could feel it searching for cracks, for moments of doubt or fear that would let it in. But I held firm. I sang my grandmother's song and thought about what it meant to be human, not perfect, not eternal, but individual, free to choose, even if the choice was difficult. The plant people fell to their knees, their bark skin cracking and bleeding sap. The forest's consciousness let out a roar of rage and frustration that shook the trees around us. And then, suddenly, it was over. The oppressive presence lifted. The unnatural silence broke, replaced by normal forest sounds. Birds calling, insects buzzing, wind rustling through leaves. Henderson and the others collapsed, their bodies returning to normal human appearance. But they were still, too still, their eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy above. They were gone, not absorbed by the forest, but truly gone, dead. I found my way out of the forest 3 days later, following real trails that led to real roads. My compass worked normally. My altimeter showed correct elevations. The geometric patterns in the trees were gone, replaced by natural, random growth. But I could still feel it. The forest's consciousness, watching me from the shadows between the trees, waiting. I resigned from the Forest Service immediately, told them I'd found the research team dead from exposure, that I'd buried them according to regulations. No one questioned my report. No one wanted to investigate further. The area was quietly declared environmentally sensitive and closed to the public. Official reason: unstable soil conditions. Unofficial reason: people who went in there sometimes didn't come out. I moved back to the reservation and became a traditional healer, studying the old ways my grandmother had tried to teach me. The stories I'd dismissed as superstition turned out to be survival guides, warnings about forces older than human civilization. The forest still calls to me sometimes. Late at night, when the wind is just right, I can hear it whispering my name, asking me to come back, promising me connection, belonging, an end to loneliness. I don't go back, but I know it's waiting. Because here's what I learned in those 3 days. The forest isn't evil. It's just old and lonely and hungry for connection. It's been dreaming for thousands of years, and those dreams are starting to bleed into the waking world. The Olympic National Forest is just one of many. There are old forests all across the Pacific Northwest, places where the trees have been growing for millennia, where the boundary between dream and reality is thin, and they're all waking up. I get reports sometimes, hikers who disappear for days and come back changed, scientific expeditions that find impossible plant formations, rangers who quit suddenly and move away without explanation. The forests are calling. They're lonely, and they want friends. They want family. They want to share their dreams with anyone willing to listen. But some dreams are nightmares, and some connections come at a price you can't afford to pay. My name is William Thatterhart. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember. Someone needs to warn the others. The forest is alive. The forest remembers. The forest dreams. And it's waiting for you to come home. Just remember, once you've heard the forest's voice, you can never truly leave. Part of you will always belong to those ancient trees, those dreaming giants that have been watching and waiting since the world was young. I still carry my grandmother's medicine pouch. I still sing her protection songs, and I still feel the forest's consciousness just at the edge of my awareness, patient and eternal and hungry. Some nights, I almost give in. Some nights, the loneliness is so deep that joining something larger seems like the only answer. But then I remember Henderson's face, twisted with bark and moss. I remember Sarah's eyes, green as old forest and empty of human warmth. I remember the hunger beneath the beauty, the consumption disguised as connection. And I stay home. I tend my garden. I help the people who come to me for healing. I keep my distance from the deep woods, because the forest is calling. It's always calling, and if you listen too long, you might just answer. The choice is yours, but choose carefully. Some invitations can't be refused once they're accepted. Some dreams never let you wake up. My name is Samuel Yazzie, and I need to tell you what happened in Glen Canyon in August of 1977. I've kept quiet about this for years, but people need to know. They need to understand what's really out there in those red rock canyons. I was then working as a ranger for the National Park Service. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area was my beat. All those twisted slot canyons and ancient ruins scattered across southern Utah. I'd grown up on the reservation, but I'd gone to college at the University of Arizona, got my degree in anthropology, thought I was pretty smart, thought I'd left all the old stories behind. My grandmother used to tell me about skinwalkers when I was little. Shapeshifters, she called them. Evil medicine men who'd turned their backs on the natural order. They could steal your face, your voice, become you in every way. I'd roll my eyes and tell her those were just stories to explain mental illness. That's what my professors taught me. Folklore was just primitive psychology. I should have listened to my grandmother. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Sarah Chen, an archaeologist from the University of Utah, had radioed from somewhere deep in the canyon system. Her team had been documenting Anasazi ruins for 3 weeks, but something had spooked them. She was talking fast, her voice crackling through the static. "We're being followed," she said, "by people, naked people. They watch us from the canyon walls." I grabbed my gear and headed out. It was already 110 degrees by 9 a.m., and the weather service was calling for thunderstorms later. Flash flood season in the canyons. You could die in minutes if you got caught in the wrong place. The drive to the canyon mouth took 2 hours on dirt roads that barely deserved the name. I parked my truck at the rim and started rigging my ropes. Dr. Chen's team had been working in a narrow slot canyon called Whispering Gallery, named for the way sound bounced off the smooth walls. It was a beautiful place, all flowing red sandstone, carved by water over millions of years. But as I rappelled down into the canyon, something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. No birds, no insects, not even the scratch of lizards on stone, just my breathing and the whisper of rope through my gear. I found their camp at the bottom, but it was empty. Tents still up, equipment scattered around, but no people. A pot of coffee sat on their camp stove, still warm. Their notebooks were open, pages fluttering in the hot breeze. I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Dr. Chen, anyone here?" Nothing, just that strange, thick silence. I started looking around the camp more carefully. The team's gear was all there, cameras, surveying equipment, food supplies, but their personal items were gone. Backpacks, water bottles, anything they'd need to survive in the desert heat. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were everywhere around the camp, pressed into the sand. Human prints, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow. And they were barefoot. Who walks barefoot in this country? The rocks would tear your feet to ribbons. I followed the tracks away from camp. They led toward the narrow end of the canyon, where the walls closed in until you could barely squeeze through. The prints were clear in the sand at first, but as I got closer to the rocks, they started to change. The heel marks got smaller. The toe impressions spread out. By the time I reached the narrow passage, they looked more like animal tracks than human ones. I stood there staring at those prints, feeling my grandmother's words echoing in my mind. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Sam, you copy?" It was dispatch back at headquarters. I grabbed the radio. "Yeah, I'm here. Found their camp, but the team's gone. Something's not right down here." Static filled the channel for a moment. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Chanting low, rhythmic chanting in what sounded like Navajo, but twisted somehow. Wrong words, wrong rhythms. "Dispatch, are you getting this? There's some kind of interference on the channel." More static. Then a voice came through clearly, my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. "Help us, Sam. We're trapped. We need you to come deeper." I dropped the radio like it was on fire. My hands were shaking as I picked it up again. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Yazzie. I need backup at Whispering Gallery. Something's very wrong here." But the radio was dead. Nothing but static. I checked my watch. 2:30 p.m. The storm clouds were building on the horizon, dark and heavy. I had maybe 3 hours before the weather turned dangerous. I needed to find Dr. Chun's team and get everyone out of the canyon before the flash flood started. I moved deeper into the narrow passage, following those strange footprints. The walls closed in around me, smooth red stone that had been carved by water over millions of years. In some places, I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The tracks led to a wider chamber where the ancient people had built their homes. Anasazi ruins clung to the canyon walls. Like stone nests, rooms and granaries and ceremonial spaces. Dr. Chen's team had been working here, documenting everything with cameras and careful measurements. I found their equipment scattered around the ruins. Cameras with smashed lenses, notebooks with pages torn out, surveying tools bent and broken, but still no people. Then I saw the first body. It was Tom Bradley, Dr. Chen's graduate student. He was sitting against the canyon wall, propped up like he was just taking a rest. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful. But when I got closer, I could see the truth. He'd been arranged, posed. His hands were folded in his lap, his legs straight. Out in front of him, someone had positioned him like a mannequin in a store window. I checked for a pulse, knowing I wouldn't find one. His skin was cold despite the heat. No wounds that I could see, no signs of violence. He just looked like he'd sat down and died, but his boots were missing. His feet were bare and clean, like someone had washed them. I started searching the ruins more carefully. The ancient rooms were built into natural caves in the canyon wall, connected by narrow ledges and stone steps. The Anasazi had lived here for hundreds of years before they disappeared, leaving behind only their empty homes and mysterious rock art. In one of the upper rooms, I found Dr. Chen's field notes. The pages were covered in her neat handwriting, but the entries got stranger as they went on. Asterisk, day 15. Found new petroglyphs in the back chamber. Images of human figures, but distorted, elongated limbs, oversized heads. Local stories say this place is cursed. Day 17. Tom says he saw someone watching us from the opposite canyon wall. Naked figure, perfectly still. When he called out, it just melted back into the rocks. Day 19. We're all seeing them now. They move like people, but wrong. Too fluid, too quick. They know we're here. Day 21. Found footprints around our camp this morning. Human prints that changed to animal prints. The Navajo have words for this. Things that aren't what they seem. Asterisk. The last entry was barely readable. The handwriting shaky and rushed. Asterisk. They have our voices now. I heard Tom calling for help, but Tom was standing right next to me. They're learning to be us. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling. This was exactly what my grandmother had warned me about. Skinwalkers could steal your shape, your voice, your memories. They could become you so completely that even your own family wouldn't know the difference. A sound echoed through the ruins, footsteps on stone. Slow, deliberate steps coming from somewhere above me. Dr. Chen, I called out. Is that you? The footsteps stopped. Then I heard my own voice calling back from the upper levels of the ruins. Sam, thank God you're here. I'm trapped up here. I think my leg is broken. But I was standing at the bottom of the ruins. That was my voice, but it wasn't me speaking. I drew my sidearm and started climbing the stone steps toward the sound. The ancient handholds were worn smooth by countless hands over the centuries. Each step took me higher, up the canyon wall, further from any escape route. Keep talking, I called out. I'm coming to get you. Hurry, Sam. Something's wrong with this place. The others are gone. I think something took them. It was my voice. Perfect in every way, same tone, same accent, same speech patterns. But I was the one climbing the steps, not the thing speaking. With my voice, I reached the upper level of the ruins and looked around. Empty rooms carved into the living rock, shadowy spaces where the ancient people had lived and worked and died. The voice had come from somewhere here, but I couldn't see anyone. Where are you? I called out. Here, Sam, in the ceremonial chamber. I followed the voice to the back of the ruins, where a narrow passage led to a circular room. This was where the Anasazi had held their most sacred ceremonies, where they'd prayed to their gods and sought visions of the future. The chamber was empty except for a circle of small holes in the floor, fire pits where the ancient people had burned offerings. But as I stepped into the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the dust. Human prints. That shifted and changed as I watched, becoming something else. Something with claws and elongated toes and joints that bent in impossible ways. Behind me, the entrance to the chamber went dark. A figure stood silhouetted against the light from outside, tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung down to its knees. It turned toward me, and I saw my own face looking back at me. My features, my expression, even the small scar on my chin from a childhood accident. But the eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too knowing, like they could see straight through to my soul. "You shouldn't have come here, Sam," it said with my voice. "This place has been waiting for you." I raised my gun, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. "What are you? What did you do to the research team?" The thing that wore my face smiled, and its teeth were too sharp, too white. "We didn't do anything to them. We became them, just like we're going to become you." It took a step forward, and I saw that its feet weren't quite right. Too long, with toes that curved like claws. As it moved, its whole body seemed to shift and flow, like it was made of water instead of flesh. "The old woman was right about us," it continued. "Your grandmother knew what we were. She tried to warn you, but you wouldn't listen. You thought you were too smart, too educated. You thought the old ways were just superstition. How did it know about my grandmother? How did it know what she'd told me? We know everything about you, Sam. We've been watching you for years, waiting for the right moment. We know about your childhood on the reservation, your time at the university, your dreams of bridging to worlds. We know about the guilt you carry, the way you turned your back on your own people." I backed away from it, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber was small, with only one entrance, and the thing blocked my path to freedom. "You can't fight what you are, Sam. You can't run from your heritage forever. We are part of this land, part of the old ways. We are what happens when the natural order is broken." Thunder rumbled overhead, and I realized the storm was getting closer. Soon the canyon would be full of rushing water, and anyone caught down here would die. "The others are already with us," the thing said. "They're waiting for you to join them, to become one of us." It stepped aside, and I saw them standing in the shadows behind it. Dr. Chen, Tom Bradley, the other members of the research team. But they were wrong, all of them. Too tall, too thin, with eyes that reflected light, like an animal's. They spoke in unison, their voices blending together into a sound that made my teeth ache. "Come home, Sam. Come back to what you really are." That's when I ran. I burst out of the ceremonial chamber and ran along the narrow ledge that connected. The ruins, behind me, I could hear them following not just one, but all of them. The sound of feet on stone, but too many feet, moving in patterns that didn't match human movement. I reached the stone steps and started climbing down as fast as I could. The ancient handholds were slick with my sweat, and I almost lost my grip twice. Above me, the things that looked like people were flowing down the canyon walls like water, moving in ways that defied gravity. I hit the canyon floor running and headed for the narrow passage that led back to the main canyon. Behind me, I could hear them calling out in voices I recognized: my father's voice, my grandfather's, my grandmother's, all dead now, but speaking to me as clearly as if they were standing right there. "Samuel, wait for us. Don't run from your family. Boy, we've been waiting so long to see you again." I knew it was a trick. I knew these things were just using the voices of people I'd loved to mess with my head. But hearing my grandmother's voice, so clear and familiar, almost made me stop. I squeezed through the narrow passage and emerged into the wider part of the canyon. The storm was getting closer. I could hear thunder echoing off the walls, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. In the desert, rain meant flash floods, and flash floods meant death if you were caught in the wrong place. I ran for my rope, but when I got there, it was gone, cut clean through about 20 feet up, the severed end swaying in the wind. I was trapped at the bottom of the canyon with no way to climb out. The rain was coming down harder now, and I could hear the distant roar of water rushing through the upper canyons. I had maybe 20 minutes before the flood reached this part of the system. I started running upstream, looking for any way to get higher. The canyon walls were smooth sandstone, impossible to climb without gear, but I remembered seeing some ancient handholds further up, places where the Anasazi had carved steps into the rock. Behind me, the things were still following. I could hear them calling out, using more voices from my past. Teachers from school, friends from college, people I'd known and cared about. They were getting closer, their voices louder and more insistent. I found the handholds and started climbing. The rock was slick with rain, and my hands kept slipping. But I could hear the flood coming now, a sound like a freight train rushing through the canyon. I had to get higher, or I'd be swept away. 20 feet up, I found a narrow ledge and pulled myself onto it. The water hit the canyon floor. Seconds later, a wall of brown foam and debris that filled the narrow space from wall to wall. If I'd been down there, I would have died instantly. I pressed myself against the canyon wall and watched the flood rage below me. Trees, rocks, and chunks of debris rushed past at incredible speed. The water was already 15 feet deep and rising fast. That's when I saw them. They were standing on the opposite canyon wall. Impossible as that seemed. 5 figures that looked like the research team, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. They were watching me, perfectly still despite the rain and wind. One of them raised its hand and waved. It was Dr. Chen or something wearing her face. She called out to me, her voice somehow audible over the roar of the flood. "You can't stay there forever, Sam. The water will go down eventually. And when it does, we'll be waiting." Another figure stepped forward. Tom Bradley, the graduate student I'd found posed like a mannequin. But this version was moving, talking, very much alive. "We know you, Sam. We've been watching you for years. We know about your dreams, your fears, your guilt about leaving the reservation. We know about the girl you loved in college, the one you never called back. We know about the job offer you turned down because you were afraid of failing." How could they know these things? These were private memories, secrets I'd never told anyone. "We know because we've been inside your head." The thing wearing Tom's face continued. "We've been feeding on your memories, your emotions, your essence. We know you better than you know yourself." The water was starting to recede, but it was still too deep and fast to cross. I was stuck on the ledge, trapped between the flood and the creatures that wanted to steal my identity. "You can't fight us, Sam," the Dr. Chen thing said. "We are part of this place, part of the old ways. We are what your people feared in the dark times, what they created stories about to keep their children safe. But you don't believe in the old stories, do you? You think you're too smart, too modern." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the canyon for a split second. In that brief moment of brightness, I saw the truth. The figures on the opposite wall weren't human at all. They were something else, wearing human shapes, like clothes that didn't quite fit. Their shadows were wrong, twisting and writhing like snakes. "Your grandmother tried to teach you," the thing continued. "She told you about the skinwalkers, about the ones who steal faces and voices. She taught you the old protections, the sacred words, the ceremonies that keep the darkness at bay. But you weren't listening, were you? You were too busy trying to escape who you really are." The water was dropping fast now, the way it always did after a flash flood. Soon the canyon floor would be exposed again, and I'd have to find another way out. "You know what we are, Sam," the Tom thing said. "Say it. Say the word your grandmother taught you." I knew the word. In Navajo, it was Ye Naldalushi, literally with it. He goes on all fours. The skinwalkers, the ones who had perverted the natural order, who had traded their humanity for power. "Skinwalkers," I whispered, and all 5 figures on the opposite wall smiled at once. "Good boy," they said in unison. "Now, you're beginning to understand. We are what happens when the balance is broken, when someone wants power more than they want to be human. We are the price of forgetting who you really are." The water had dropped enough that I could see the canyon floor again, littered with debris from the flood. I had to move soon, or I'd be trapped here all night. And I had the feeling that darkness would make things much worse. "We'll make you a deal, Sam," the Dr. Chen thing called out. "Come down from there. Join us willingly. We'll make it quick and painless. You'll become one of us, and we'll let you keep some of your memories. You'll still be you, just ... improved. And if I refuse, then we'll take you anyway. But it won't be pleasant. We'll peel away your identity piece by piece, memory by memory, until there's nothing left but an empty shell. Then we'll fill that shell with ourselves and send you back to your people. Your family will never know the difference." The water was low enough now that I could probably make it across the canyon, but I'd have to drop down onto the slick rocks and hope I didn't lose my footing in the current. "Decide quickly, Sam," the thing wearing Tom's face said. "The night is coming, and we're much stronger in the dark." I looked at the rushing water below me, then at the creatures on the opposite. While neither option seemed particularly appealing, that's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago when I was just a boy. He'd been teaching me about the old ways, about the ceremonies and protections that kept evil at bay. "The skinwalkers are strong," he'd said, "but they have weaknesses. They fear the sacred things, the blessed. Things white ash from a special fire, prayers spoken in the old language, symbols carved in the traditional way. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small pouch I always carried. White ash from a fire, blessed by my grandfather before he died. I'd kept it with me for years, not really believing in its power, but unable to throw it away. You remember, the Dr. Chen thing said, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in its voice. But it won't be enough, Sam. There are too many of us, and only one of you, maybe. But I had to try. I opened the pouch and scattered the ash in a circle around myself on the narrow ledge. Then I started to pray, not in English, but in the old language, the way my grandfather had taught me. The creatures on the opposite wall began to wail, a sound like wind through broken glass. They were moving now, flowing down the canyon walls like liquid shadow, heading for the water that separated us. The flood was still too deep and fast for a human to cross. But these things weren't human. The skinwalkers hit the water and kept moving, flowing through the flood like it was air instead of raging current. They moved wrong, all flowing joints and impossible angles, but they moved fast. I kept praying, speaking the old words my grandfather had taught me. The white ash glowed faintly in the dim light, creating a barrier between me and the approaching creatures. But I could feel the power fading already. The ash was old, and my faith in it was weak. The first one reached my ledge, the thing, wearing Dr. Chen's face. It pressed against the ash barrier like it was hitting an invisible wall. Sparks flew where it touched the sacred circle, and the creature screamed in pain and rage. You can't hide behind that forever, Sam, it snarled, and its voice was different now, deeper, more animal than human. We have all night, we have all the time in the world. The other four joined it, surrounding my small ledge. They pressed against the barrier from all sides, testing it, looking for weaknesses. Each time they touched the ash, there were sparks and screams, but I could see that the circle was getting weaker. You want to know what really happened to the research team? The Tom thing asked. We didn't kill them, Sam. We replaced them. One by one, we took their memories, their personalities, their very souls. Then we sent them back to their families, their universities, their lives. The real Dr. Chen died 3 days ago, but her husband won't know the difference when she gets home. I felt sick. If that was true, then these creatures could be anywhere. How many people had they already replaced? Oh, we've been busy. The thing wearing Tom's face said, reading my thoughts. We've been spreading across the southwest for decades. Rangers, scientists, tourists, anyone who comes into our territory and stays too long. We learn from them, become them, then take their place in the world. The barrier was failing. I could see cracks appearing in the ash circle, dark lines spreading like a spiderweb. Soon the protection would collapse entirely. And then, you're wondering why we want you specifically. The Dr. Chen thing said, it's not just because you're here, it's because of what you represent. You're caught between two worlds, Sam. The old ways and the new, the traditional and the modern. You're the perfect bridge. What do you mean? Think about it. You grew up on the reservation, learned the old stories, the old protections. But you also went to college, got a degree, learned to think like a white man. You understand both worlds, can move between them freely. With your knowledge, your credentials, your connections, we could spread much further than we ever have before. The cracks in the ash circle were getting wider. I could feel the malevolent presence of the creatures pressing against the weakening barrier. We could become professors, government officials, policymakers. We could shape the future of this country, guide it toward what we think it should be. All we need is the right person to open the door for us. And if I refuse, then we'll take you anyway. But it will be ... messier, more painful. We prefer willing hosts, but we'll make do with what we can get. The barrier collapsed. The creatures rushed forward, their forms shifting and flowing like smoke. But instead of attacking me directly, they began to change, taking on new shapes, new faces. The first one became my father, dead now for 10 years. He looked exactly as I remembered him, weathered face, kind eyes, the small scar on his forehead from a childhood accident. Son, he said, his voice warm and familiar. I've been waiting so long to see you again. I knew it was a trick. Knew this wasn't really my father. But seeing him again, hearing his voice, it was almost more than I could bear. Don't listen to them, Samuel. Another voice, from behind me. I turned and saw my grandmother, looking just as she had before she died. They're not real. They're just shadows wearing the faces of the dead. But when I looked back, my father was gone. In his place stood my college roommate, Mike, grinning the same goofy grin he'd had when we were 20 years old. Sam, buddy, long time no see. Remember that time we drove to California? Spring break, 1972. You were so worried about leaving the reservation, but I convinced you to come with me. Best week of your life, you said. It was true. Every detail was exactly right. How could these creatures know such specific memories? Because we've been watching you, the thing wearing Mike's face said. We've been inside your head, feeding on your memories, your emotions, your dreams. We know everything about you, Sam. Every secret, every shame, every moment of joy and sorrow. More figures appeared around me, all people from my past. My high school girlfriend, my favorite professor, my grandfather who'd taught me the old ways. They were all perfectly rendered, down to the smallest detail. We can give them back to you. The thing wearing my grandfather's face said, we can make them real again. All you have to do is join us willingly. Let us take your memories, your identity, your place in the world. In exchange, you can be with everyone you've ever loved. It was tempting. God help me. It was tempting. These people had shaped my life, and I'd lost them all. To see them again, to talk to them, to have them back. But my real grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. The skinwalkers are liars, Samuel. They will tell you anything to get what they want. They will promise you the world, but all they bring is death and corruption. You're not real, I said, looking at the figure wearing my grandfather's face. You're just parasites wearing the faces of the dead. The creature's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in its eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or anger. Very well, it said. We tried to do this the easy way. All the figures began to change, their familiar faces melting away to reveal the creatures underneath. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and joints that bent in impossible directions. Their skin was pale and translucent, showing the dark veins beneath. Their eyes were black holes that seemed to suck in light. You will join us, they said in unison, their voices blending into a sound like wind through a graveyard. Willingly or not, you will become one of us. They rushed forward, and I did the only thing I could think of. I jumped. The water was still, deep and fast, but not as deadly as it had been during the height of the flood. I hit the current and let it carry me downstream, away from the creatures and their impossible ledge. The water was cold and full of debris from the flood. I got tumbled and rolled, scraped against rocks and submerged logs. But I managed to keep my head above water most of the time, and the current was carrying me toward the main canyon where I might be able to find a way out. Behind me, I could hear the creatures screaming in frustration and rage. They'd expected me to give up, to accept their offer or submit to their power. They hadn't expected me to choose the flood over them. The current carried me around a bend in the canyon, and I saw something that made my heart leap with hope, a section of the wall that had collapsed, creating a slope of broken rock that I might be able to climb. I fought my way to the canyon wall and grabbed onto a boulder. The water was still trying to drag me downstream, but I managed to pull myself up onto the pile of rubble. From there, I could see a path to the top of the canyon. I started climbing, my hands and feet finding purchase on the broken stone. It was slow going, and I kept slipping on the wet rocks, but I was making progress. The top of the canyon was maybe 50 feet above me, and safety was within reach. That's when I heard the voice. Sam, help me. I looked down and saw Dr. Chen clinging to a rock in the middle of the flood. She was being swept downstream, her face desperate with terror. Please, Sam, I can't hold on much longer. I hesitated. Was this real? Was this the actual Dr. Chen, somehow still alive? Or was it another trick by the skinwalkers? It's me, Sam, the real me. They kept me alive because they needed my memories intact. I escaped when the flood started, but I can't swim in this current. She looked real. She sounded real. But I'd seen how perfectly the creatures could imitate human voices and faces. If you're really Dr. Chen, I called down, tell me something only she would know. Something from your research notes. The petroglyphs in the back chamber show elongated human figures, images of the skinwalkers themselves. The Anasazi knew about them, left warnings carved in stone. They called this place the Canyon of Shadows. That was right, I'd read it in her notes. But the creatures could have taken that information from her memories. Please, Sam, I'm slipping. I looked at the figure in the water. trying to decide. If it was really Dr. Chen, I couldn't leave her to die. But if it was a skinwalker, going back would mean my death. The figure lost its grip on the rock and started to be swept downstream. "Sam," it screamed, and the terror in its voice sounded absolutely real. I made my choice. I started climbing down toward the water, abandoning my escape route to try to save someone who might not even be human. It was the right thing to do. It was also probably the stupidest thing I'd ever done. I reached the water's edge just as the figure swept past. Without thinking, I dove in and swam after it, fighting the current and the debris that filled the flood. The water was cold and violent, full of tree branches and rocks that could crush a man in seconds. I caught up to the figure just as it went under. I grabbed it and pulled it to the surface, then fought my way to a section of the canyon wall where I could get a handhold. We clung to the rock together, both of us gasping and shivering. "Thank you," the figure gasped. "Thank you, Sam," I thought. I was going to die. I looked at its face, Dr. Chen's face, wet and frightened and perfectly human. If this was a skinwalker, it was the most convincing performance I'd ever seen. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Can you climb?" She nodded, and we started working our way along the canyon wall toward the collapsed section where I'd been climbing before. The water was still dangerous, but it was dropping fast. Soon we'd be able to walk on the canyon floor. We reached the rubble pile and started climbing. Dr. Chen was weak and shaky, but she managed to keep up. We climbed in silence, focused on finding handholds and footholds on the whetstone. Halfway to the top, she spoke. "Sam, I need to tell you something about what happened to my team." I kept climbing, not looking back. "What about them?" "They're not dead." "Not exactly. The skinwalkers didn't kill them. They replaced them. The things you saw, the ones that looked like Tom and the others ... those were the real people. Changed, transformed, but still alive somewhere inside." I stopped climbing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we might be able to save them. There are old stories, old ceremonies that can force a skinwalker to release its host. If we can find the right medicine man, the right ritual ... Dr. Chen," I said quietly, "how do you know about skinwalker ceremonies? You're not Navajo." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed, and the sound was wrong, too high, too bright. "You're right, Sam. I'm not Navajo. But I've learned so much from Dr. Chen's memories. So much about you, about your people, about the old ways." I turned around and looked at her. She was smiling, but her eyes were black holes that reflected no light. "You came back for me," she said. "Even knowing what I might be, you came back to save me. That's what makes you perfect, Sam. That's what makes you exactly what we need." I let go of the rock and fell. It wasn't a long drop, maybe 10 feet to the pile of rubble below. I landed hard, rolling on the wet stones, but nothing was broken. Above me, the thing wearing Dr. Chen's face was climbing down after me, moving with fluid grace that no human could match. I ran for the water. The flood was almost gone now, just a shallow stream running through the canyon. I splashed across and started climbing the opposite wall, looking for any way to escape. Behind me, the creature was calling out in Dr. Chen's voice, pleading with me to come back. But I'd learned my lesson. I wasn't going to be fooled again. I found a narrow crack in the canyon wall and squeezed through it, scraping my skin on the rough stone. The crack led to a series of small chambers, natural caves that had been carved by water over millions of years. I crawled through the narrow spaces, following the sound of wind that meant there was another way out. Behind me, I could hear the creature trying to follow, but the passages were too narrow for its elongated form. The caves led me to a different part of the canyon system, one I'd never seen before. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, not the usual images of animals and hunters, but warning symbols. Pictures of twisted human figures with too long limbs and hollow eyes. The Anasazi had known about the skinwalkers, had left warnings, carved in stone. I found a way to climb out of the canyon just as the sun was setting. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air clean and cool. I made it back to my truck and drove straight to the nearest phone, calling in a report to my supervisor. The official story was simple. Dr. Chen's research team had been caught in a flash flood. Their bodies were found 3 days later, scattered throughout the canyon system. Death by drowning, the report said. No mention of the strange circumstances, the impossible footprints, or the things that had worn their faces. But I knew the truth, and I knew the skinwalkers were still out there, still hunting, still replacing people with their twisted copies, I quit the Park Service 2 weeks later, went back to the reservation, back to my grandmother's house where the old protections still held. I started learning the traditional ways I'd rejected for so long, the ceremonies, the prayers, the ancient knowledge that white education had taught me to dismiss. I became a medicine man, one of the keepers of the old ways. I learned to bless ash and sage, to draw protective symbols, to speak the words that could ban evil spirits. And I waited, because I knew they weren't finished with me. The Sk had wanted me for a reason, and that reason hadn't gone away. They could still be out there, wearing the faces of people I'd known, working their way closer to me. Sometimes I wonder if the person writing this story is really me. Sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder if the face looking back is my own, or if it belongs to something else that's learned to be me so perfectly that even I can't tell the difference. The canyon is still there, still waiting. The Park Service sealed off the area where Dr. Chen's team died, calling it unstable due to recent flooding. But I know the real reason. They found things down there, evidence of something that doesn't belong in the official reports. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I can hear voices calling from the desert. My own voice, speaking words I never said, calling me to come back to the canyon where the shadows wait. I keep my grandmother's white ash close now. I say the old prayers every morning and every night. I wear the traditional protections, the turquoise and silver that guard against evil spirits. But I know it's not enough. The skinwalkers are patient. They have all the time in the world, and sooner or later they'll find a way to finish what they started in Glen Canyon. If you're reading this, be careful who you trust. Look closely at the people around you. Are they really who they claim to be? Do their shadows fall the right way? Do their eyes reflect light the way human eyes should? The old stories are true. The warnings carved in stone are real. And somewhere out there in the desert, things that aren't quite human are wearing the faces of people you love. My name is Samuel Yazzie, and I'm telling you this because you need to know. The skinwalkers are real, and they're still hunting. Don't let them find you.